For centuries, the ancient Greeks and Romans remained familiar to later generations. Their history survived because medieval scribes continued to copy and preserve their texts. The same cannot be said for the Hittites. After the collapse of their Bronze Age empire, the memory of this powerful warrior society faded almost completely. For more than 3,000 years, their name, cities, and achievements disappeared from human knowledge. That silence began to break in the 19th century. In the early 1800s, a French explorer named Charles Texier travelled through Anatolia while searching for traces of a Roman settlement. What he found instead was something far older. In the area known today as Bogaskoy, he encountered the remains of a vast city. Massive stone walls rose from the ground, and monumental gates were guarded by carved figures unlike anything from the classical world. Lions, sphinxes, and a bare-chested warrior stood frozen in stone, watching over ruins that clearly belonged to a forgotten civilization. Nearby, Texier explored a rocky sanctuary known to locals as Yazili Kaya. The rock faces were covered with reliefs depicting long processions of strange figures, accompanied by an unfamiliar hieroglyphic script. Fascinated, Texier sketched what he saw, unaware that he was standing in the former capital of one of the great empires of the Bronze Age. The city was Hattusa, though its true identity would remain unknown for decades. Not long after, Texier encountered another mysterious monument carved into a mountain pass west of Anatolia. The relief showed a warrior in profile wearing a pointed hat and distinctive curled shoes, holding weapons associated with both hunting and warfare. Similar carvings were later studied by other scholars, who initially misidentified the figure as Egyptian, despite the obvious differences in style. This interpretation was eventually rejected when connections were drawn between this relief and the carvings at Yazili Kaya. When the hieroglyphic script was finally deciphered many years later, the warrior was identified as a local ruler from the 13th century before Christ, a king serving within the political system of the Hittite world. This discovery confirmed that the carvings belonged to a powerful Anatolian tradition, not to Egypt. During the same period, inscribed stones bearing the same mysterious script began to appear across northern Syria. Travellers noticed that these stones had been reused in later buildings, embedded in markets, homes, and even religious structures. Locals believed the stones possessed healing powers and resisted their removal. Despite this, many were taken away for study, helping scholars piece together a long-lost historical puzzle. By the late 19th century, scholars began to connect these discoveries with a people mentioned briefly in biblical texts. At an academic gathering in London, the civilization responsible for the ruins and inscriptions was identified with the Hittites, a name preserved in ancient Hebrew tradition. Biblical passages describe them as formidable warriors, placing them on equal footing with Egypt's armies. These references suddenly took on new significance. Early theories were deeply flawed. The civilization was mistakenly dated to a later period, and its political centre was placed in the wrong region. Even so, these early studies marked the first serious attempts to reconstruct Hittite history. Debate continues over the exact relationship between the biblical references and the Anatolian Empire. What is clear is that the people of Hattusa never called themselves Hittites. They referred to their land as Hatti and their language as Nizite, while neighbouring powers used different names entirely. Despite these uncertainties, the term Hittite remains in use today as a convenient label for this Bronze Age empire. As archaeological work expanded, German scholars played a central role in excavating the region. Detailed casts were made of the Yazili Kaya reliefs, preserving them for study far from Anatolia. These efforts coincided with major excavations at classical sites nearby, reinforcing Germany's influence in Near Eastern archaeology at the time. Through these combined discoveries, a civilization once erased from memory slowly returned to history. Systematic excavation at Hattusa began at the turn of the 20th century. Early work was led by French researchers, but the most decisive phase started when German archaeologists took over the project. Under their direction, and with the assistance of local scholars, excavations uncovered an enormous archive of clay tablets. These tablets were covered in wedge-shaped impressions pressed into wet clay, a writing system known today as cuneiform. This method of writing relied on combinations of small marks created with a reed stylus. By arranging these marks in different patterns, scribes recorded spoken language in permanent form. Cuneiform was not limited to a single tongue. Across the Hittite world, it was used to record multiple languages spoken within the empire. When the first tablets were recovered from Hattusa, scholars quickly recognized one of these languages. It was Akkadian, a language already understood by researchers in the 19th century. Akkadian had inherited its writing system from Sumerian, the earliest known written language in human history. After conquering southern Mesopotamia, Akkadian rulers adopted this script to record their own Semitic language. Over time, Akkadian became the shared language of diplomacy across much of the ancient Near East. Kings from distant lands exchanged letters in Akkadian, even when it was not their native language. Evidence of this international system came from Egypt, where a large collection of diplomatic correspondence was discovered. These letters reveal conversations between the great powers of the 14th century before Christ, including the rulers of the Hittite Empire. The tablets from Hattusa confirm that the Hittites fully participated in this international world. Alongside the Akkadian texts, excavators found many tablets, written in a language no one could understand. The symbols could be read aloud, but the words themselves made no sense. This language turned out to be the primary language of the Hittite state. Known today as Hittite, it represents the earliest known form of the Indo-European language family. Modern European languages, including English, ultimately belong to this same linguistic group. The breakthrough came during the First World War, when a linguist noticed striking similarities between Hittite words and familiar European terms. One short sentence proved decisive. It spoke simply of eating bread and drinking water. From this, scholars realized that Hittite grammar and vocabulary followed patterns still visible in later languages. With this discovery, the Hittite language was finally unlocked, opening thousands of texts to interpretation. Hittite writing followed conventions shared with other cuneiform traditions. Some signs represented sounds, others stood for entire words borrowed from old languages, and some symbols were used only to indicate categories such as gods or kings. Certain tablets were written in two languages side by side, serving as dictionaries or teaching tools. In addition to Hittite and Akkadian, texts written in the language of the Hurrians were also found. These people were both rivals and cultural partners of the Hittites, exerting deep influence on religion and ritual. Learning to write cuneiform was difficult. Unlike alphabetic systems with a limited number of letters, cuneiform required mastery of hundreds of signs. As a result, most people in Hittite society could not read or write. Literacy was limited to trained scribes who worked in royal administration, religious institutions, and diplomatic service. These scribes were educated in specialized schools where they learned by copying texts again and again. Their work recorded laws, treaties, rituals, military campaigns, and royal decrees. Some scribes trained in the capital were later sent to provincial centres, ensuring that information flowed across the empire. Occasionally, a formal document ends with a brief personal message, revealing everyday concerns. One such note complains about a servant who had been stealing household goods. These small details offer rare glimpses into ordinary life within a world otherwise dominated by kings and gods. The Hittites also used a second writing system that puzzled scholars for many years. This script appears in monumental carvings on rock faces and temple walls. Though some symbols were recognized early on, real progress came only when a bilingual inscription was discovered in southern Anatolia. The text recorded the achievements of a local ruler centuries after the fall of the Hittite Empire, and was written in both this hieroglyphic script and a known alphabetic language. Through this discovery, scholars finally understood that the script represented the Luwian language, a close relative of Hittites spoken in neighbouring regions. Over time, the Hittites adopted this script for royal seals and monumental inscriptions. Its use may have been a deliberate statement of cultural identity, distinguishing the Anatolian world from Egypt and Mesopotamia. Long after the Hittite Empire collapsed, this writing system continued to be used by successor states. Early excavations at Hattusa focused almost entirely on recovering tablets. Tens of thousands were uncovered, including a famous peace treaty between the Hittites and Egypt. However, excavation methods were crude by modern standards. Many tablets were damaged, discarded, or removed without records of their original locations. As a result, valuable contextual information was lost forever. Later, archaeologists shifted attention toward mapping the city itself. Buildings, fortifications, and sacred spaces were carefully documented. Excavations were interrupted by global conflict but resumed in the mid-20th century under new leadership. Since then, generations of archaeologists have continued work at the site, refining our understanding of how the city functioned. Beyond the capital, discoveries at other sites have revealed the broader structure of the Hittite homeland. Several towns have been identified as administrative, religious, or military centres. Some locations played major roles in imperial history but remain unidentified, their names preserved only in texts. Even today, important Hittite cities have yet to be found. Unlike many ancient civilizations, the Hittites left no surviving king lists. Absolute dates are rare and depend largely on references from foreign records. As a result, timelines remain approximate, and even the number of kings sharing the same name is uncertain. This makes Hittite history unusually fluid, open to ongoing revision. The Hittites were not the first inhabitants of Anatolia. Long before their rise, the region supported complex societies, whose ideas and symbols endured. One of the most remarkable early settlements was a Neolithic town known for its wall paintings, animal symbolism, and powerful imagery of a female deity associated with wild creatures. Themes introduced in this early period would echo through Anatolian religion for millennia. The true foundations of Hittite civilization, however, were laid during the Middle Bronze Age. At the beginning of the second millennium before Christ, Assyrian merchants established trading colonies across Anatolia. Their most important centre was located at a site later known as Nisa. These traders brought tin and textiles and returned home with precious metals. Along with goods, they introduced writing. Thousands of letters found at these settlements recur to business deals, family disputes, and daily concerns. Though written in Assyrian, these texts preserve the earliest traces of the Hittite language in personal names and loanwords. Writing took root in Anatolia, allowing history to be recorded for the first time. In the age when Assyrian merchants were still running their trade networks across Anatolia, the strongest and most established people in the Central Plateau were the Hattians. They did not form a single unified kingdom. Instead, they lived in a patchwork of city-states, each with its own ruler and interests. One of these small realms was centred on a place called Hattusa, a settlement that would later become the heart of a far greater power. In the 18th century before Christ, a king from a southern city named Kasara rose aggressively through this fractured landscape. His name was Pithana. He seized the important trading hub of Kanesh and made it his political centre. After him came his son Anita, a figure remembered for ruthless ambition. Anita turned his armies against Hattusa, crushed it, and left the city in ruins. Later tradition claimed he ordered the site to be sown with weeds and placed a curse on anyone who might rebuild it, as if he wanted to erase the city's future as completely as he had erased its walls. What makes Anita even more important is that his campaigns were recorded. A text describing his family's deeds survived through later copies, preserved by scribes long after his time. This document is considered the earliest known composition in the language that would later be associated with the Hittite Kingdom. Another small but striking piece of evidence from the same era surfaced in Kanesh. an inscribed spearhead that identified a building as belonging to Anita, suggesting that his authority was not just remembered in legend but marked in material remains. Over time, Kanesh, also known as Nisa, gained a special status in later memory. It became an ancestral point of reference. From this name came the label used for the Hittite language in their own world, a language they called Nisite. For a long time, scholars imagined a clean story in which Indo-European newcomers entered Anatolia, dominated the Hattians and imposed their language. But a slower, more realistic process appears far more likely. Rather than a sudden replacement, the local population seems to have been absorbed into a new political order, gradually adopting the Indo-European language while carrying older traditions forward. This helps explain why early Hittite culture contained strong echoes of Hattian life. Religious themes, artistic choices, and even names that belonged to the older world continued into the new one. The Hattian language itself did not survive in documents written by native speakers. It appears only in fragments embedded inside Hittite texts, like a faint voice preserved inside someone else's records. From the beginning, the Hittites were never a single ethnic group. They were a composite society shaped by intermingling peoples and shifting loyalties. In the land of Hatti, communities of Anatolian origin lived alongside influences from Mesopotamia and Syria. What made them recognizable as one people was less about shared blood or even shared language and more about shared space. They were defined by the homeland they lived in, distinct from the wider territories ruled indirectly through vassal states. Different origins, one core land, one political centre. Later tradition named a ruler called Labana as the first king of the Hittites. The details around him are not perfectly clear, but the outline is powerful. He appears to have started as the ruler of a small kingdom in north-central Anatolia, and then expanded by conquest, pulling surrounding states into his orbit. Later generations described him as a relentless campaigner, subduing enemy lands through force. He set a pattern that would define Hittite kingship for centuries, the ruler as warrior, the crown as a military engine. Even Labana's household became a model. His queen's title carried prestige, and in later generations the name associated with that office became a lasting label for royal women. His capital was said to be Kusar, a place that still has not been securely identified on the ground. His successor made a dramatic choice that shaped everything that followed. He moved the capital to the ruined site of Hattusa and adopted a throne name that tied his identity directly to it, presenting himself as the man of that city. Some historians have even argued that the first king and this successor were the same person under different names, because the royal title was used in more than one way. Whatever the case, the old curse placed on Hattusa did not last. The city was rebuilt, repopulated, and transformed into a fortified centre of power. Refounding Hattusa was not a simple relocation. It meant building an entire living system, homes, defences, storage, administration, and the infrastructure needed to keep thousands alive. The site had clear advantages. Its rocky terrain offered natural fortification. Nearby forests provided timber. Springs ensured reliable water. But the move also carried symbolism. A new capital created the chance to forge a new identity, cutting ties with old rivalries and old humiliations and replacing them with a story of renewal and dominance. From this new base, the Hittite king launched campaigns beyond Anatolia into Syria, targeting major rivals and wealthy cities. One important coastal centre was attacked and destroyed, showing that the kingdom now had reach as well as ambition. Yet the expansion quickly exposed a weakness that would haunt Hittite history again and again. When armies marched far from the homeland became vulnerable. Threats rose from multiple directions. Western regions began to raid the borders, forcing repeated campaigns to restore control. Even when local rulers accepted vassal status, stability remained fragile. At the same time, danger pressed in from the southeast, where Hurrian groups moved into the vacuum. The Hittites often struggled with limited manpower, and their strategic dilemma was brutal. To fight abroad meant risking invasion at home. The king managed to push back these incursions, but the Hurrians remained a persistent threat for much of the kingdom's history. They were not only enemies, they were also cultural forces whose traditions and ideas seeped into Hittite religion and court life. Among their strongest political formations was a powerful state that would later become one of the defining rivals in the region. Hittite royal records celebrated these campaigns as proof of greatness. They boasted of conquered lands and of wagon loads of captured wealth brought back to decorate and strengthen the new capital. The king even compared himself to one of the most famous empire builders of Mesopotamia, placing Hittite ambition within the same heroic tradition of world conquerors. But conquest was not the only crisis. Succession within the royal family became a threat as dangerous as any foreign enemy. The question of who would inherit the throne triggered plots, rebellions, and purges. Potential heirs were removed, relatives were exiled, and the royal household fractured into competing factions. The king rejected one candidate after another as family members ignored orders, listened to advisors, or openly turned against him. In the end, he chose a young successor from within the family, adopting him as the next ruler. In a remarkable scene, preserved by later tradition, the dying king is portrayed giving direct guidance to the boy who would replace him. He lays out the expected behaviour of a ruler and insists the instructions be read regularly, like a monthly reminder of duty and restraint. The tone is personal and anxious, and it ends with a blunt recognition of mortality. Even the most powerful man in the kingdom could not bargain with death. After his passing, the young king took the throne and continued the outward drive of Hittite power. His campaigns became legendary. He struck deep into Syria and even reached Babylon, one of the most famous cities in the Near East. The fall of that city ended an old royal line and reshaped the political balance of Mesopotamia. Yet triumph created new consequences. Power vacuums formed, new groups moved in, and the entire regional system shifted as rival peoples expanded into the spaces left behind. Then, abruptly, the king was murdered by someone within his own circle. A relative by marriage seized power and justified the assassination by claiming that the earlier destruction of Babylon had angered the gods. What followed was a chain of violence that became almost routine. Rulers killed, heirs eliminated, power taken and defended through blood. In one grim episode, the new king's family was captured and murdered by enemies during war, deepening the atmosphere of fear and instability. After his reign, further assassinations followed, including a son killing his own father to seize the throne. Even when a ruler died naturally, the succession rarely remained peaceful. Rival claimants wiped out competitors, and the court became a place where survival depended on intrigue. Out of this chaos emerged a king who tried to impose order. He took power without a battle, and chose a throne name that may have been symbolic, echoing a deity associated with restoring balance to a disturbed world. His central achievement was not a conquest, but a legal reform. He established rules for succession designed to stop the endless cycle of coups. The heir should be the son of the primary wife. If that was impossible, succession should move to a son from a secondary partner. If no male heir existed, a son-in-law could be adopted into legitimacy. This king also understood that force alone could not stabilize the kingdom's position. He began using diplomacy more deliberately, negotiating agreements rather than relying only on war. In dealing with a strategically placed southern state, he accepted an alliance that preserved its independence, recognizing its importance as a corridor between larger powers. That region would continue to shift loyalties, bargaining with rivals and switching sides whenever it served survival. The Hittite New Kingdom begins with a ruler who stepped onto the throne around the early 14th century before Christ, a king remembered as Tudalia. His first years were defined by war in the west, where a chain of rival kingdoms stretched across Anatolia. These western lands included states such as Hapala, Mira, the Seha River country, and a place the Hittites called Wilusa. That name matters because many historians connect Wilusa to Ilios, the city later celebrated in Greek tradition as Troy. A later Hittite letter hints that Wilusa once became the centre of a serious dispute between the Hittite king and a foreign ruler from a sea-connected power known as Ahiawa, a name that sounds strikingly close to the Achaeans of Greek epic. Most scholars link these Ahiawans to the Mycenaean Greeks. The letter suggests that the two sides clashed over Wilusa and eventually settled the matter by agreement. Archaeology adds another layer of mystery. The city we call Troy shows destruction in the late 13th century, not far from the time when Hattusa itself would later be devastated. Yet the connection between Wilusa in Bronze Age politics and Troy in later storytelling remains uncertain. What does seem clear is that Wilusa became a subject state tied to the Hittite sphere of control by the early 13th century, perhaps earlier. Western Anatolia could be especially dangerous when its states united. Tudalia faced a large coalition, remembered today as a Western League formed by many allied communities. He defeated it and then used a brutal but effective strategy to prevent future resistance. Large numbers of captured soldiers and chariot fighters were removed from their homelands and resettled elsewhere. This was meant to drain the region of manpower and break its ability to rise again. A short-lived revolt followed, but it was quickly crushed and its leader was executed. One striking detail from later discovery reinforces the reality of these clashes. A sword made in a style associated with the Mycenaean world was found near the Hittite capital, and its inscription described it as a captured enemy weapon taken as tribute from those Western wars. But victory in the West came with a price. As Hittite forces pushed outward, the homeland was left exposed. Raiders from the northern highlands swept down and invaded. The king drove them back, only for fresh trouble to build in the east and southeast, where the great Mitanni power was tightening its grip over Syria. Tudalia responded with campaigns that brought wealth and strategic gains. Strongholds linked to Mitanni influence were broken, and a key buffer region was brought under direct Hittite control, strengthening the empire's southern frontier. After Tudalia, the throne passed to Arnuanda, connected to the royal family through marriage. From this reign, we get a vivid window into the unstable politics of Western Anatolia through a document aimed at a man named Maduwata. The story begins earlier, when Maduwata fled from an Ahiawan leader and sought refuge in Hatti. He must have been significant, because the Hittite court did not merely shelter him, it installed him as a vassal ruler and granted him territory near the western frontier. In theory, he was a dependent ally. In practice, he became a problem. Maduwata expanded aggressively, ignoring his obligations. He carved out a wider domain, seized lands across the west, and even launched an overseas attack on Cyprus. He also tried to build his own diplomatic network, including a proposed marriage alliance with an Arzawan ruler. When questioned, he offered convenient excuses, presenting his actions as secret plots meant to benefit Hatti. At one point, his meddling provoked enemies to invade his own territory, and he fled for safety, forcing the Hittite king to rescue him. Even then, the punishment was limited to harsh warnings rather than open destruction. That restraint reveals something important. At this stage, the Hittites were cautious about deep western expansion. Past campaigns had repeatedly opened their borders to raids elsewhere. A troublesome vassal who kept the west unstable could, in a strange way, serve Hatti's interests, as long as he did not openly rebel. While the west simmered, the northern raiders returned with devastating force. They attacked religious centres, looted sacred objects, and shattered cult images. Temples were stripped of precious vessels and ceremonial garments. Priests and temple workers were carried off and forced into service. The Hittite state lacked the resources to respond effectively, and royal efforts achieved only limited success. Then the crisis widened. Under Arnuwanda's successor, the kingdom faced attacks on multiple fronts at once, a storm of invasions pressing inward from every direction. Foreign rulers heard reports that the Hittite heartland was collapsing. The capital was abandoned, and the royal court withdrew to a safer refuge city deeper in Anatolia. From that refuge, the Hittite state refused to die. Over many years, the king began the slow work of rebuilding power, fighting north and west, retaking ruined cities, restoring defences, and repopulating shattered settlements. Much of this recovery was driven by a brilliant commander, the king's son and closest advisor, Suppiluliuma. Yet when the weakened ruler finally died, the throne did not immediately go to this proven war leader. It was promised to an older heir. The court did not accept that outcome. Suppiluliuma had already proved himself the kind of forceful figure the kingdom needed, and the army stood behind him. The designated heir was murdered, and Suppiluliuma seized the throne. With that act, the Hittite Empire entered a new and aggressive phase. Suppiluliuma's main goal was Syria. His greatest rival there was Mitanni. He struck hard, even reaching the enemy's heartland, yet the Mitanni king remained elusive, slipping away and surviving through shifting alliances. Letters from that king show a personality both proud and demanding, complaining that Egypt had sent cheap gifts instead of real wealth, and insisting that true gold should be sent in abundance. Suppiluliuma responded with political skill as well as violence. He supported a rival claimant for the Mitanni throne, weakening his enemy from within, and he secured alliances with key Syrian states, including a wealthy coastal kingdom prized for its resources. As he advanced, defeated rulers and their families were deported to Hattusa, both as hostages and as trophies. Important cities were placed under direct Hittite control, and Suppiluliuma appointed his sons as regional governors, creating a stable Hittite administration in Syria. This structure allowed him to return north and deal with renewed raids at home. The capture of a major Syrian stronghold marked a turning point. Mitanni's power cracked, and the king who had evaded Hittite pressure was eventually assassinated by his own people. The weakened remnants of Mitanni soon fell under the shadow of a rising Assyrian power, which would become the next great threat on the international stage. One of the strangest episodes of this era involved Egypt. After a sudden royal death, an Egyptian queen reportedly sought a foreign husband to secure her position. A Hittite prince was sent south for marriage, but could have changed the balance of power dramatically. He never arrived. The prince was murdered on the journey, and the alliance collapsed into bloodshed. Suppiluliuma retaliated with invasions into Egyptian-held territories. Prisoners taken in these campaigns were marched back to Hatti, but they carried a hidden weapon more destructive than any army: plague. The epidemic tore through the Hittite homeland for years. It killed civilians, weakened defences, and struck the royal family itself. Suppiluliuma died, and the son who succeeded him also died after a short reign. The crown then passed to a younger son, Mursili, who inherited both a powerful empire and a kingdom already bleeding from disease. Mursili's early years were dominated by war in the west, where remaining Arzawan states were finally crushed with the help of his brother, who ruled a major Syrian centre as governor. After conquest, large populations were forcibly relocated into the Hittite heartland. This policy served two purposes. It drained conquered regions of people who might rebel, and it replenished a homeland that had been emptied by plague and war. Over time, this reshaped Hatti into a mixed society, filled with communities drawn from many lands. Vassal rulers were installed to manage western territories under Hittite oversight. In Syria, Hittite authority was held together by the governor system Suppiluliuma had created. But when two key governors died around the same time, the region became unstable. Assyria moved quickly, striking into Hittite-held territory and capturing an important stronghold. Mursili responded with force, drove the invaders out, and restored the system by appointing the next generation of the royal family as governors. In the north, however, the Highland raiders remained a constant problem. Mursili achieved only limited gains, though he did manage to reclaim a sacred city that had been lost for generations, allowing Hittite worship to return there after 2 centuries of silence. Yet the greatest enemy of Mursili's reign was not a foreign army. The plague still ravaged the land, draining the population and leaving the kingdom exposed. Searching for answers, the king turned to religious inquiry and concluded that the disaster was not random. It was punishment for crimes committed before his reign, especially the bloodshed that had brought his father to power. In response, Mursili performed rituals and composed desperate prayers, pleading for mercy and promising reparations. He argued that the guilty were already dead, and that it was unjust for the living to suffer endlessly. He even warned that if the epidemic continued, the gods themselves would lose their offerings because the people who baked sacred bread and poured libations would keep dying. Some of these prayers were meant to be read aloud every day, as if constant repetition might finally soften divine anger. The texts do not describe symptoms. They focus on fear, guilt, and the feeling of a kingdom collapsing under invisible pressure. Mursili himself did not die from the plague, but he was struck by another affliction that disrupted his ability to speak, possibly the aftermath of a severe medical episode. Rituals were performed in an attempt to transfer the illness away from the king, because the stability of the empire depended on his strength. Mursili tried everything to save the woman he loved. In his prayers, he begged the gods to accept gifts and show mercy, promising that if his wife recovered, her life would become a constant song of gratitude to the divine. But the sickness did not lift. Soon after, Gasiluia died, and the palace turned grief into suspicion. The powerful older queen, long resented at court, was accused of sorcery. A formal trial followed. She was condemned and driven out of the capital, her influence finally broken. Even after justice was declared, the loss did not fade. Mursili's surviving words reveal a king crushed by mourning, describing a life in which his spirit feels pulled downward, as though the underworld is calling him every day. After this tragedy, the royal household did not become calmer. A woman named Puduhepa later became associated with the court, and regardless of exactly where she fit within the family, she too became a source of tension. Her authority was seen as intrusive, her presence politically dangerous. Eventually she fell from favour, was put on trial, and was exiled by the next king. The pattern repeats like a shadow over the dynasty. Illness, suspicion, accusations, and the removal of figures who were perceived as threats to stability. Then the empire entered a new phase under Mu'atali, a ruler remembered not only for war but for a decision that shocked his own world. Early in his reign, he moved the seat of kingship away from Hattusa and established a new royal centre at a city called Hattusa, somewhere in the south. Hittite tradition framed the decision as obedience to the storm god, but even so, it was an extraordinary step. For centuries, Hattusa had been the symbol of Hittite identity, the place that had to be retaken whenever it was lost. Why abandon the heart of the kingdom? The simplest explanation may be security. Northern raiders remained a constant menace, and shifting the administrative centre south could place the court farther from danger. Another possibility is strategy. Syria was becoming the main arena of imperial conflict, and the south was closer to the front lines where a showdown with Egypt was taking shape. There is also religion. The temples of the south may have demanded renewed attention after generations in which northern cult centres dominated. Hattusa was not erased from the map. It continued as a major regional hub, especially for the northern lands, which were governed by the king's brother, the man who would later rule as Hattusili. Sacred symbols and divine presences were transferred to Taruntasa, signalling that this was meant to be permanent, not a temporary retreat. Yet after Mu'atali's death, the religious and ancestral focus was drawn back to Hattusa. Even then, Taruntasa did not disappear. It remained significant and would later become a centre of opposition, a place where rivals could gather strength against kings who ruled from the old capital. While these internal changes unfolded, the struggle with Egypt over Syria reached its breaking point. Two key territories, once controlled by Egypt, had shifted into the Hittite sphere. In an age where borderlands meant power, wealth, and prestige, neither empire was willing to yield. The tension exploded into the clash that came to define Muwatalli's reign, the Battle of Kadesh. This battle was fought in the 13th century before Christ, near the Orontes River. On one side stood the Hittite king with forces drawn from across his empire. On the other stood the Egyptian army led by Rameses, a pharaoh who built much of his image around warfare and victory. We know the battle mainly through Egyptian accounts carved into temple walls, where the story is told in vivid detail. The Egyptians marched in divisions named after their gods, moving north toward Kadesh. The leading unit, commanded by the pharaoh himself, was approached by men who claimed to have deserted from the Hittite side. They delivered a carefully crafted lie. The Hittite army, they said, was far away. The Egyptians believed it. They camped near Kadesh, settling in as if the threat was distant. But the truth was waiting nearby. The Hittite army was concealed close at hand, positioned to strike at the moment of maximum confusion. When the deception was exposed through captured scouts and interrogation, it was already too late. Hittite forces surged into the Egyptian camp as tents were still being raised and formations were still loosening into rest. The impact was devastating. The leading Egyptian division was scattered, and another unit approaching from the south was struck in motion. Rameses sent frantic messages to summon the remaining divisions, but they were too far away to help immediately. For a moment, it looked as if the battle had already been decided. Then discipline collapsed on the Hittite side. Believing victory was secure, many turned from fighting to plunder. Chariots were loaded with loot, and attention drifted away from the enemy's regrouping. This gave the Egyptians a chance to recover their formation. Reinforcements began to arrive, pressure shifted, and the Hittite assault was pushed back. The Egyptians later claimed a glorious triumph, listing fallen Hittite commanders and celebrating the pharaoh's courage. Yet the reality was more complicated. The fighting ended without a clear and total victory for either side. What mattered most was the outcome on the map. The key disputed territories remained under Hittite control, which meant the balance of advantage leaned toward Hatti. The Egyptians withdrew southward, while Hittite forces pursued them and displayed enough strength to prove that Egypt had not broken their power. In practical terms, Kadesh and the surrounding region did not return to Egypt. The struggle had reached a stalemate that both sides eventually recognized. Years later, that stalemate turned into one of the most famous peace agreements of the ancient world. A formal treaty declared enduring peace between the two empires. The agreement promised non-aggression, established rules for maintaining stability in Syria, and included clauses for mutual support if either side faced rebellion or foreign attack. It also demanded the return of fugitives, a reminder that even peace treaties were designed to control movement as much as armies. One version contained a notable political safeguard. It required Egypt to recognize the legitimacy of Hittite royal succession, strengthening the claim of the ruling line in Hatti at a time when internal legitimacy mattered as much as external security. Both traditions preserved copies of this peace. The Hittites recorded it in their scribble language of international diplomacy, and Egypt displayed its version as monumental propaganda. Today, a modern reproduction of the treaty is displayed at the headquarters of the United Nations, held up as a symbol that rival powers can choose negotiation instead of endless war. After Muwatalli, his son took the throne. At the same time, the capital's focus shifted back toward Hattusa, and the king's uncle, Hattusili, was stripped of his authority over the northern lands. This sparked a fierce power struggle. The uncle and nephew collided, and in the end, Hattusili seized kingship. The younger man was exiled, and the throne passed to a figure who would shape the empire through diplomacy as much as force. Hattusili's story was framed by devotion to a powerful goddess. As a sickly child, he was placed into temple service, and the goddess was credited with preserving his life. Throughout his career, her support was described as the divine stamp that legitimized his rise. In the struggle for power, the goddess was said to have turned commanders to Hattusili's side through dreams and signs, making politics feel like destiny. Before becoming king, Hattusili married a woman linked to the goddess's cult centers, and that marriage became one of the most significant partnerships in Hittite history. Her name was Puduhepa, and she was far more than a ceremonial queen. She operated as political force, signing agreements, shaping religious policy, and acting as a diplomatic voice to foreign courts. Under her influence, the Hittite religious world was reorganized and unified, as new territories brought in new gods and traditions. She treated many deities not as rivals, but as different names for the same divine power, merging religious systems into a single imperial framework that could hold together a multicultural empire. Diplomacy became a defining feature of this era, and Puduhepa stood at its center. She managed marriage alliances with foreign powers, and her correspondence with Egypt shows a queen who could negotiate as sharply as any king. When Egypt complained about delays in royal marriage arrangements, she responded with pointed criticism, making it clear that alliances were not only about receiving gifts, but about respecting the terms and the dignity of both courts. Her influence reached into economics as well. Evidence from legal disputes shows that she controlled sealed goods, supervised shipments, and punished officials accused of theft or substitution. The Queen's administration understood something fundamental. Loyalty could be strengthened through controlled access to wealth. Officials were allowed to claim certain old resources, textiles, and equipment as incentives for faithful service, while high-value metals remained strictly protected because they could always be remelted and reclaimed. The marriage of Hattusili and Puduhepa appears to have been both politically effective and personally close. During the king's illnesses, she composed urgent pleas to the gods, acting as advocate and protector. Their public image was carefully crafted as well. A rock relief carved near modern Kayseri shows the king and queen in parallel scenes, each making offerings to the supreme deities of the state. The message is clear. The rulers are not only political leaders, they are living representatives of divine order, serving as the earthly counterparts of the king and queen among the gods. After Hattusili's death, Puduhepa continued to hold influence, an enduring presence in a court where most figures vanished quickly through exile, trial, or death. Then their son Tudalia took the throne, and the empire began to face the heavy pressure of decline. Under Tudalia, religious restoration became a major policy. Festivals were revived, neglected cult images were renewed, and the sanctuary at Yazili-Kaya was embellished, linking the king directly to the divine assembly carved into stone. But divine favour was desperately needed, because the reign was turbulent. Unrest in the west demanded repeated campaigns, and outside forces continued to stir the frontier. The most dangerous opponent, however, was rising in the east, Assyria. At first, letters between kings spoke of friendship, as if both sides hoped to stabilize relations. But that fragile tone collapsed when Assyria pushed into territories that the Hittites considered under their protection. The rivalry escalated beyond polite words. Tudalia responded with a remarkable strategy. He attempted to cut trade routes and block cooperation at a crucial coastal gateway, an early example of economic pressure being used as a weapon of statecraft. War followed. A major battle ended in a humiliating Hittite defeat, worsened by the betrayal or cowardice of allies who refused to stand with the king when the situation turned dangerous. Tudalia's anger toward these vassals is easy to understand. Empires depend on obedience. When allies disappear at the critical moment, an imperial system begins to fracture. Despite setbacks, Tudalia launched an ambitious campaign against Cyprus. The island was forced into tributary status, and its ruler was reportedly taken captive along with his household. It was an unusual achievement for a power not known as a maritime nation. Such operations depended on allied fleets and subject states that could transport soldiers and supplies across the sea. The motives may have been strategic retaliation, or perhaps the desire to secure access to copper, a resource Cyprus was famous for, and which mattered deeply in an age where trade networks were becoming more fragile. Control over Cyprus did not last. Later, a new Hittite king would claim another invasion of the island, describing naval battles off its shores. These accounts are among the earliest descriptions of combat at sea. Yet for all these claims, direct archaeological traces of Hittite presence on Cyprus remain limited, leaving historians to balance written boasts against material silence. At the same time, the Hittite throne itself was never fully secure. Because Hattusili had seized power through conflict, his descendants faced lingering doubts. Plots formed. A failed assassination attempt against Tudalia is remembered, and behind the scenes another figure drew attention: Kurunta, tied closely to the royal family and the southern city that had once been made the imperial centre. Kurunta had been raised alongside Tudalia, and the two shared a relationship that mixed affection with political calculation. During the earlier succession struggle, Kurunta had sided with Hattusili rather than with his own brother, and he was rewarded with authority over Taruntasa. Under Tudalia, this arrangement was formalised again in a new agreement that reaffirmed Kurunta's power, reduced his burdens, and even granted him the right to choose his own successor. It was a deal that speaks to how fragile unity had become. The Hittite king needed loyal partners, and powerful regional rulers needed guarantees. The empire was still standing, but the ground beneath it was beginning to shift. Some clues suggest Kurunta was not satisfied with ruling only from Taruntasa. Seal impressions found in the Hittite heartland carry his name alongside a striking choice of words. He began calling himself Great King, a title normally reserved for the single supreme ruler of the empire. Even more suggestive is a rock carving at Hatip. It shows a warrior god carrying the standard weapons of the age, and the accompanying inscription names Kurunta with the same elevated style, presenting him as a heroic son of Muwatalli and, again, a great king. Taken together, these details look like more than vanity. They hint that Kurunta may have been staking a claim to the throne itself, using Taruntasa as a political base from which to challenge the authority centred in Hattusa. How exactly this played out is still unclear. One scenario is open rivalry. Taruntasa becomes the headquarters of a breakaway branch of the royal family, determined to restore the city's earlier status as the seat of kingship, and to present Kurunta as the rightful successor, especially since his brother had once been removed from power. Another possibility is quieter and more pragmatic. The empire may have been informally divided, with cousins sharing authority to prevent civil war. A letter from Tudalia to the Egyptian court adds another layer of ambiguity, because it shows real concern for Kurunta's health, and requests medical help for him. Whether this was written before or after Kurunta adopted the royal title is unknown, and the most frustrating part is that Taruntasa itself has never been located with certainty. If it is ever found and excavated, it may finally reveal whether Kurunta was a rebel in the making or a partner in a divided empire. The last Hittite king was Suppiluliuma II. He took the throne after a brief reign by his brother and ruled during the final desperate phase of the kingdom's existence. Early in the 12th century before Christ, Hattusa was abandoned. The end came not as a single dramatic fall, but as a grinding collapse driven by hunger, insecurity, and political breakdown. Famine hit hard. Outside records describe emergency shipments of grain sent north to keep the land alive. Letters from Hatti to coastal allies speak with panic, demanding ships to move food, framing the situation as a matter of survival rather than ordinary trade. As shortages worsened, the empire squeezed its vassals for more tribute. In places under Hittite pressure, families were pushed to extremes, even selling their children to meet demands or simply to endure. At the same time, drought and environmental stress appear to have forced communities to relocate, adding migration and instability to an already fragile system. In this atmosphere, the king invested in religious monuments around Hattusa, as if appealing to the gods and ancestors might still reverse the tide. Inscriptions from this period boast of military achievements, including campaigns connected to Cyprus and operations against Hattusa. If those reports reflect real fighting, they may point to an attempt to crush a southern rival and reassert control before an internal threat became lethal, but any recovery was temporary at best. Hattusa was evacuated, the court withdrew with what it could carry, and later the city was burned. By the time flames consumed it, the site may already have been mostly empty. Where the fleeing Hittite leadership went remains unknown. Their records simply stop, as if the state's voice went silent mid-sentence. Hatti's collapse was part of a wider catastrophe. In the early 12th century before Christ, major powers across the eastern Mediterranean and Near East fell into crisis or vanished. The palace societies of Greece were shattered. Long-standing dynasties in Mesopotamia were disrupted. Coastal Syrian cities that had once thrived on trade were destroyed. Egypt survived, but it entered a period of weakening and internal strain. Ancient Egyptian texts speak of waves of attackers who have become famous under the name Sea Peoples, but their identity remains debated. They were likely not a single nation, but a mix of displaced groups, migrants, and war bands moving through a world that was unravelling. Even so, it is risky to explain everything as the result of one invading force. In the case of Hattusa, the most likely culprits for the final burning were the northern raiders who had plagued the kingdom for centuries, and even that may have happened after the capital was already abandoned. The bigger picture looks gradual rather than sudden. The most convincing explanation is a pile-up of crises, climate stress leading to famine, internal rebellions, disrupted trade, and repeated invasions. When tightly connected systems are already strained, one shock can trigger another until the whole network fails. When trade routes break, allies stop responding, vassals revolt, and food supplies collapse, even a powerful empire can crumble like a chain of falling dominoes. Yet Hittite influence did not vanish overnight. For centuries after the empire's fall, successor states in parts of Anatolia and northern Syria kept elements of Hittite culture alive. Old religious ideas, artistic styles, and political habits endured in new forms, even as the imperial centre disappeared. To understand how the Hittites lasted as long as they did, we have to look at the world they navigated. Their homeland sat in a pressure zone. Raiders threatened from the north. Strategic gateways to Syria shaped politics in the southeast. Western Anatolia held rival coalitions and restless vassals. Beyond that lay powerful maritime neighbours and the islands that controlled key resources. And looming over everything was Egypt, first fighting other rivals in the Levant and later turning its attention against Hatti. The Hittites survived by balancing violence and negotiation, using war when necessary, marriage and treaties when possible, and pressure when resources demanded it. A huge amount of what we know about this international order comes from diplomatic letters written in the shared language of the time. Kings wrote to kings as if they belonged to an exclusive club, calling one another brother, exchanging gifts, arranging marriages, and arguing over protocol. Sometimes the politeness slipped and the blunt reality surfaced, especially when a ruler refused to pretend that equality was real. These letters reveal not only alliances, but insecurity. Vassal rulers begging for troops as cities burned, complaints about rivals gaining influence, and constant anxiety about which side would dominate next. One extraordinary episode shows just how unpredictable diplomacy could be. A widowed Egyptian queen, suddenly vulnerable and without a clear heir, wrote to the Hittite king asking for a prince to marry. It was an unheard-of proposal because Egypt normally resisted sending royal women abroad and looked down on foreign dynasties. The offer sounded like a door opening to unimaginable power. The Hittite king investigated cautiously, and eventually a prince was sent. But the prince was murdered before the marriage could happen. The queen was then forced into a different match at home, and the failed alliance led to retaliation, raids, and the spread of plague that would later devastate Hatti itself. When diplomacy failed, the Hittite army became the final argument. Hittite society valued campaigning as a normal rhythm of life, and the king often led the army in person. When multiple fronts demanded attention, other royals could command in his place. The state maintained watchposts and fortified ridges to warn of enemy movement, and it relied on stored supplies positioned across the land to keep soldiers fed. The army was built around two main forces, mass infantry and an elite chariot corps. Hittite chariots were engineered for stability, allowing 3 men to ride together: a driver, a primary fighter, and a shield-bearing protector. That extra stability gave them a brutal edge in charges, especially when enemy lines were unprepared. Training was rigorous. A famous manual from the Hittite world describes how horses were conditioned through diet, exercise, and intense drills designed to build speed and stamina. The aim was clear: a chariot force that could strike hard, remain coordinated, and keep moving even under strain. Infantry then followed, armed with spears and swords, supported by axes and maces, wearing relatively light armour built for movement rather than the heavy protective gear of later eras. The state also shaped loyalty through ritual. Soldiers swore oaths that were reinforced by vivid symbolic acts. Everyday processes like brewing could be turned into terrifying metaphors, warning that oathbreakers would be crushed, cooked, and destroyed in body and spirit. Libations poured into the earth could be framed as blood, with the ground itself invoked as the thing that would swallow a traitor. These performances were psychological weapons. They created memories designed to bind soldiers to the king through fear as much as honour. War brought profit through tribute and captured wealth, but it also drained the economy. Campaigns consumed food, pulled manpower away from farming, and strained an already limited population. That is why the Hittites depended heavily on treaties. A treaty could secure a province without constant fighting. The vassal promised obedience, military support, intelligence, and annual tribute. In return, the vassal kept local autonomy and gained Hittite protection. Each new ruler required renewal of agreements, keeping the system locked in place by paperwork as much as by weapons. These treaties followed a recognizable pattern. They reminded the vassal of past favors, listed obligations, called on witnesses, and promised rewards for loyalty while threatening curses for rebellion. It was a method of control that allowed an empire with limited manpower to project authority far beyond its core. It is time to step into the Hittite landscape itself and visit a small group of places where stone, earth, and carved images still preserve the atmosphere of an empire. These sites are only a fraction of what survives, yet together they let us see both the grand moments of state power and the quiet routines of ritual life. What looks like broken masonry today once framed processions, festivals, royal decisions, and the daily work of people who believed the gods were present in the texture of their world. Our first stop is Hattusa, the Hittite capital in north-central Anatolia. Walking the site now takes imagination, because the great walls and buildings survive mostly as low foundations. Even so, the scale is still readable in the lines of stone that trace where ramparts, gates, and major complexes once stood. A reconstructed section of fortification near the entrance gives a helpful sense of how the city originally looked, with mud brick rising above stone footings in the traditional building method of the region. The city's long history is layered. The earlier settlement belongs to the peoples who lived here before the Hittites rose to power. Later, merchants from Mesopotamia established a trading community in the area, and the city was then destroyed in a violent episode remembered for generations. What matters most for the Hittite story are the phases when the capital was founded, expanded, attacked, rebuilt, and finally abandoned and burned. After the empire's collapse, a later population returned and lived among the ruins, leaving behind a final chapter of occupation. Hattusa began as a fortified centre around a high rocky ridge that functioned like a natural citadel. From here the first royal complex was established, and the choice makes sense when we think like planners. The location offered strong defensive advantages. Forests provided timber, springs ensured water, and the city's position allowed communication across the wider territory. Hattusa was not built to sit on a major trade artery, and it was not primarily an industrial hub. It functioned above all as an administrative and sacred centre, a place where the state organised itself and where the gods were honoured through constant ritual. The most memorable features for visitors are the monumental gates. These entrances were once fitted with heavy wooden doors, likely reinforced with metal, and they were decorated with imposing stone guardians. At one gate, 2 lions flank the passage, their open mouths and stylized manes still communicating force even after centuries of weathering. Small depressions near the lions may have been used for pouring offerings as people passed into the city, turning the act of entry itself into a moment of ritual. Farther south, a gate guarded by sphinxes creates a different mood. The creatures face both inward and outward, as if watching the city and the world beyond it at the same time. Their divine status is signalled by crowned headgear, and the high position of the gate offers sweeping views over the surrounding landscape. It has the feel of a threshold designed for ceremony, not merely for defence, and beneath it a long stone tunnel runs through the earthwork, a hidden passage that adds to the sense of engineered complexity. Another gate displays a carved figure of a warrior, positioned so that he faces the route outward from the city. The figure is armed and dressed in a way that suggests divinity as much as soldiership, with details that emphasise physical strength and presence. The placement feels intentional. This is the kind of image that would bless departing troops and greet returning processions. From this side of the city, the road naturally leads toward the nearby sanctuary of Yazulakaya, making the landscape itself feel like part of a sacred route. In the southern district of the capital, the remains of many temples cluster together, showing how heavily the city's life revolved around worship. Although only their foundations survive, the plans repeat a familiar pattern: an entrance corridor leading into a central open court, with a more restricted inner space set toward the rear, surrounded by small rooms for storage and work. These structures were originally built largely of mud brick with flat roofs supported by timber and reeds, and traces suggest that some interiors were once painted. The largest temple complex dominated the lower part of the city, and was devoted to the highest-ranking deities of the state religion. Here, stone bases still mark where cult images once stood. Unlike the dark inner rooms found in some other traditions, Hittite sanctuaries could be designed to admit light, so the sacred figures were not hidden in permanent shadow. These images were likely made from wood and covered with precious materials, and they were not treated as immovable objects. During major festivals, they could be placed on carts and carried through the city, turning streets and gates into extensions of the temple. A temple was not only a place for prayer, it was a working institution. Food offerings had to be prepared daily, which meant ovens, brewing areas, and kitchens nearby. Textiles were produced to dress sacred images and to supply ceremonial clothing. Storerooms held equipment and supplies. Treasuries protected valuable objects, including gifts received from abroad and prized items brought back from war. Scribes managed archives that recorded procedures, agreements, and the detailed steps of ritual life. Guards controlled access. In the open courtyards, sacrifices could be performed, myths could be reenacted, music and dance could accompany ceremony, and the city could gather to witness religion as a public event rather than a private one. Hattusa also had to function as a survival machine. Underground grain storage areas were engineered to preserve cereals through cold seasons and crisis years by keeping the atmosphere stable and low in oxygen. These reserves mattered not just for winter, but for times when harvests failed or enemies threatened supply lines. Later, kings increasingly depended on grain arriving from outside the homeland, and the fear of empty granaries became a political and religious anxiety, because hunger could destroy order faster than armies. The richest window into Hittite life came not from walls but from archives. Thousands of clay tablets were recovered from palace and temple contexts, written in wedge-shaped script and in multiple languages. Among them are diplomatic texts, legal decisions, and above all ritual documents, which describe religious life with extraordinary detail. One especially striking find was a treaty recorded on a bronze tablet, intentionally hidden beneath paving stones near a major gate. Its existence hints at tense politics near the end of the empire and the struggle between rival branches of the royal family. The royal complex itself sat on the citadel ridge and connected to the upper parts of the city by raised routes. Visitors arriving through the main gates would have been guided into controlled ceremonial spaces, eventually reaching a formal hall where the king received envoys, negotiated agreements, and accepted tribute and gifts. Yet, the puzzle of everyday population remains. Outside the palace and temple zones, clear residential quarters are scarce, suggesting that many inhabitants lived beyond the walls. As insecurity rose in the final phase, some people appear to have crowded into the city and even repurposed sacred buildings into dense living spaces. That shift feels like a social signal. When people start sleeping inside former temples, it suggests fear, displacement, and weakening confidence in the state's protection. Two late monuments from the empire's final ruler stand out in the upper city. One carried an exceptionally long inscription in the local hieroglyphic tradition, now mostly worn away, yet still hinting at a narrative of campaigns and achievements, including fighting connected to Cyprus. Another structure includes an arched chamber linked to a sacred pool and decorated with relief showing both a solar deity and the king presented in a heroic warrior style. The message is unmistakable. Even as the kingdom strained, the official image insisted on divine favour and royal strength. In a collapsing world, monuments can become both prayer and propaganda. Just beyond the capital lies Yazilikaya, a natural rock sanctuary shaped into open-air chambers under the sky. The place was used for centuries, but its most elaborate carved scenes belong to the later period of Hittite power. There is a gatehouse and a temple-like approach, suggesting that visitors did not simply wander in, but entered through an organised ritual space. The ancient name of the sanctuary is unknown, yet the meaning of its imagery is clear enough. It is a stone theatre of the divine world. In one main chamber, reliefs show a long procession of gods. Many were adopted from neighbouring traditions, showing how the Hittite religious universe expanded as the empire absorbed lands and ideas. Some figures are identified by signs carved beside them, while others are recognisable through attributes: crowns, weapons, symbolic animals, and distinctive costumes. Narrow benches beneath the reliefs may once have held offerings, turning the chamber into both gallery and altar. Two processions advance toward a central meeting scene at the back, male gods approaching from one side, goddesses from the other. Among the male deities is a striking group of 12 shown in motion, their overlapping limbs suggesting speed and rhythm, as if the stone itself is trying to capture a ritual run. Mountain gods appear with garments shaped like jagged peaks, and cosmic imagery shows sky and earth held in balance by supernatural beings. Bulls, wheat symbols, sun and moon emblems, and crowned divine figures create a visual language that mixes nature, kingship, fertility, and cosmic order into one unified parade. Standing in Yazilikaya, it is easy to feel that the Hittites wanted the divine world to be seen, not just spoken about. The sanctuary is not a hidden chamber. It is open to light and weather, and that choice matters. It turns belief into landscape and makes the gods part of the same sky that watches over the capital nearby. Hattusa and Yazilikaya together form a single spiritual geography, the city of administration and ritual labour, and the rock sanctuary where the divine community is carved into the living stone. One of the most striking figures in the rock sanctuary is a goddess who refuses to fit neatly into a single category. The warrior deity known as Shauska, often linked with Ishtar, appears inside the line of male gods rather than among the goddesses. The sculptors make the point visually. Her hairstyle and crown follow a masculine style, and her pose carries the confident stride of a fighting god. Yet she still wears a woman's skirt, and the relief hints that underneath it she is dressed like a male warrior in a short kilt. Wings rise from her shoulders like those of other battle-ready deities, reinforcing that this is a divine fighter, not a gentle court figure. At her side stand two attendants, Ninata and Kulita, rendered in the more traditional female form. Their feet vanish beneath long skirts, and each carries an object that looks like a mirror, suggesting service, ritual, and display surrounding a deity who embodies power in a deliberately blended way. The goddess procession approaches from the opposite side and is shorter, but it is carefully composed. Each goddess wears a tall, cylindrical crown, and some crowns are shaped with notches that resemble city walls, as if divinity is being linked to protection, territory, and the ordered life of settlements. Within this group appear goddesses connected with birth, destiny, and the realm beneath the earth. In other words, the female line gathers forces that govern life's arrival, life's limits, and what waits beyond it. At the centre where both parades meet, the sanctuary presents the divine marriage that anchors the whole cosmic order. The storm god greets his great consort, the sun goddess of the royal city. In this imagery, the storm god stands as a warrior ruler, crowned and armed, lifted above the earth by mountain gods whose bent shoulders become his living pedestal. Across from him, the sun goddess advances on the back of a striding leopard, a symbol of controlled ferocity and royal authority. Behind her stands their son, also carried by a feline, followed by attendants and family members arranged like a royal court. A double-headed eagle supports the next figures, turning the scene into a layered display of power, lineage, and cosmic structure. Even the animals are not decoration. They are part of the message that the world is held up by divine hierarchy. Near this central vision, the human king appears watching the gods. He is the only mortal represented in the sanctuary's main chamber, but he is not shown as an ordinary man. His clothing and posture echo the style of a deity, and his presence declares that kingship stands close to the divine realm, almost mirroring it. A second chamber feels different. It is smaller, more enclosed, and its carvings are spaced more widely, giving the rock itself a heavier silence. The entrance is guarded by winged demons with lion heads and human bodies, arms raised as if they are ready to spring. Inside, the king appears again, this time under the direct protection of a towering god who wraps an arm around him and grips his wrist. The gesture is intimate and commanding, like a divine guide leading a human representative. The running group of 12 gods returns here too, but now each holds a curved sword, and the scene feels less like procession and more like a charged ritual symbol. Another figure is shown as a weapon shaped into a god, a sharp reminder that the underworld is not only a place of the dead, but also a realm of force. Deep niches cut into the stone likely held lamps, and the space seems designed for ceremonies conducted at night, when flickering light would have made the figures appear to move and breathe. What Yazilkaya was used for is still argued about, but the reliefs themselves point toward more than one purpose. It works as a ceremonial stage, a place where seasonal festivals could be performed in the presence of the gods carved on the walls. It also carries strong underworld associations, especially in the second chamber, suggesting that it may have served as a memorial space connected to royal death and ancestral veneration. The sanctuary brings fertility and death into the same sacred landscape. In one chamber, the storm power meets the solar power, a union that signals renewal and abundance. In the other, images tied to the underworld press downward, reminding us that life in an agrarian world depends on cycles, the seed disappears into darkness before it rises again. Some researchers have also suggested that the sanctuary functioned as a kind of calendar carved in stone, where repeating groups of deities could reflect months, phases, and larger cycles of time. In that reading, the running 12 would naturally evoke the months of a year, while longer processions might map the rhythm of days. The idea does not cancel the religious function, it supports it, because festivals require precise timing, and a sight open to the sky invites attention to sun and shadow. Even now, light changes the reliefs dramatically across the day and the seasons, revealing some figures sharply, while leaving others almost invisible. Leaving the rock sanctuary, the route takes us to a different kind of sacred engineering. A spring complex built to frame water as a divine presence. At a site known today as a Flatun Pina, blocks of stone were arranged inside a pool fed by a natural source. At the centre stands a large, structured monument built from many fitted stones. The main deities occupy the middle, while below them mountain gods appear with hands clasped, their bodies shaped so that water could flow through openings in their mountain-like skirts. Around the central pair stand additional supernatural figures, arms raised as if supporting the upper levels of the scene. Above them, winged solar symbols crown the composition. The entire arrangement turns the spring into a model of the universe. Heaven above, earth below, and the divine rulers holding the structure together. Along the pool walls, smaller sculptures add detail to the sacred setting. Seated goddesses appear in niches, and another solar figure faces across the water, with a block that may have functioned as an altar. Other figures are shown moving toward the central monument, as if even the carved stone participates in procession. Nearby, a massive block carved with bull heads seems to have had a hydraulic role, turning the movement of water into part of the ritual display. This is the key point of the place. Architecture and sculpture are used to control a natural spring so that water becomes a visible, staged expression of divine order. Such a sanctuary likely served cleansing rituals, because water was not only practical but spiritually active. Springs could be treated as passages between worlds, channels through which forces from below could rise into the human realm. In healing practices, clay drawn up from water could be imagined as life-bearing material, and the spring's constant rising flow could be used as a metaphor for driving impurity out of the body. Finds from the pool itself support the sense of ritual use. Broken animal figures appear to have been deposited intentionally, and small ceramic vessels were left in the water as if offerings were surrendered directly to the spring. The imagery at Eflatun Puna also resembles other luxury objects that show stacked divine beings, supporting cosmic symbols, suggesting a shared visual language across regions. One unusual feature is that many figures face forward rather than being shown in profile, which is less common in Hittite relief art. Nearby, a huge unfinished monument lies where it was abandoned, depicting the storm deity standing on a mountain god and flanked by lions. The stone was so massive that moving it may have been beyond the practical limits of the time, leaving a frozen glimpse of ambition and engineering challenge. The final stop is Alaka Hoyuk, a small site close to the capital but layered with much older history. Long before the Hittites, elite burials here were furnished with rich metal objects, including distinctive standards shaped like sun discs and animals, likely used in funeral display and wagon decoration. In the later imperial period, the settlement seems to have developed into an important cult centre. Its ancient name is still uncertain, but the scale of religious importance suggests it was tied to major worship traditions of the region. A dam built in the late empire still functions for irrigation today, and this kind of infrastructure fits what we know about royal projects that linked water management with sacred dedication. A fragmentary monument from the site indicates that such construction was not only practical, but also offered to the gods, turning engineering into devotion. Alaka Hoyuk greets visitors with a dramatic entrance, a gate watched over by stone sphinxes. These guardians are carved as female figures, adorned with jewellery that signals status and ceremony. Inside the walls, the largest complex is a multi-purpose centre, part sanctuary, part administration, where religious activity sits side by side with the practical work of storing, recording, and distributing resources. The outer towers of the gate carry one of the most fascinating art programs from the late Empire. Long stone panels carved in shallow relief. The work was never fully finished, but what survives still feels alive, like a festival frozen in motion. Many of the panels tell the story of a grand procession. The line of participants moves toward ritual focus points where royalty and divinity meet. On one side, the king and queen appear in an act of worship, centered on the storm deity represented through a bull, an image that ties divine power to strength, weather, and fertility. On the opposite side, the movement turns toward a seated goddess figure, a calm central presence likely linked to solar worship. Between these focal scenes, the procession expands into a whole community of roles: attendants, guards, musicians, and people leading animals forward as offerings. The reliefs aren't only solemn, they also include performers, small-bodied acrobats in motion, and a figure engaged in a dangerous-looking act with a blade. Whatever the exact mechanics, the message is clear. This festival involves spectacle, skill, and controlled risk as part of sacred performance. Alongside the ceremony scenes, the same monument also shows hunting imagery. This is not just decoration for sport. In the Hittite world, the wild landscape outside the city was both real and symbolic, full of forces that needed to be recognized, negotiated, and ritually managed. A hunt connected the king and the gods to that untamed space. In these scenes, animals such as deer, boar, lions, and even a charging bull become more than prey. They become signs of power drawn from nature and presented back to the divine realm. Some panels suggest the moment when game is formally offered, as if the hunt is completed only when the altar receives what the wilderness yielded. Together, procession and hunt create a single narrative cycle: prepare, perform, offer. This is a good place to understand a wider truth about Hittite art. The dominant themes are not battlefield triumphs or graphic displays of victory. Instead, the art repeatedly returns to ritual, gods, sacred animals, and royal participation in worship. Even when kings are shown, they appear as officiants rather than as conquerors. And when Hittite imagery is carved onto cliffs and passes, it can function like a statement on the landscape, marking territory and influence with a visual language of divinity and authority. Some of the smallest objects reveal this same world in miniature. Seals were everyday tools and high-status symbols at once. They served as signatures on clay documents and as security marks on doors, containers, and shipments. Pressed into wet clay or rolled across it, they left clear images and sometimes inscriptions naming the owner. Materials range from stone and semi-precious gems to metal, and the designs often centre on gods, worship, and protective imagery. A common seal scene shows a human figure approaching a deity, a tiny ritual captured in a few centimetres. Others display animals and vegetation in patterned sequences, turning the natural world into ornament and meaning. The seal was identity, authority, and belief, all combined into one portable object. When we look at Hittite ceramics from the early kingdom period, the storytelling becomes even more vivid. Most pottery is plain, but a special group of relief-decorated vessels stands out as something extraordinary. Figures were sculpted separately and applied around the pot in bands, creating a narrative that wraps in a continuous loop. These scenes show banquets, music, offerings, processions, and moments that appear tied to marriage and temple ritual. Musicians play large instruments, attendants prepare food, and worshippers move towards sacred icons, often a bull that signals the storm deity. Some vessels include clever hydraulic features, openings and channels that let liquid pour out through animal heads, transforming a libation into a visual performance. Wine could suddenly appear like streaming blood from a bull's mouth, making the act of offering feel dramatic, physical, and unforgettable. Other vessels present a temple facade, an altar, and carefully staged ritual movement. Animals led forward as sacrifices, a god receiving offerings, and women seated in a scene that suggests preparation, adornment, or a sacred domestic moment, possibly linked to the treatment of divine images as living presences that were clothed, fed, and paraded. Another pot shows acrobats flipping over a bull surrounded by music and dance, implying that athletic spectacle was part of sacred celebration. What matters most is the overall impression. Long before the famous rock sanctuaries of the later empire, Hittite artists were already building complex visual narratives, ritual life, sound, movement, sacrifice, and community onto everyday objects. Hittite art gives us a world filled with gods, kings, ceremonies, and sacred power. What it rarely gives us is the ordinary household. We do not often see farmers at work, bakers in a courtyard, or potters shaping clay. Even the clothing we associate with Hittite soldiers is mostly learned from divine figures, because warrior gods appear far more often than real armies. That imbalance tells us something important. In their visual culture, the meeting point between elite humans and the divine mattered more than everyday routine. The human body itself is usually treated with restraint. Full nudity is uncommon, and when it does appear, it is either in a narrow context like infancy, or in a striking, exceptional image that seems designed to command attention. In general, Hittite gods look surprisingly human. Their divinity is not shown through strange anatomy or monstrous forms, but through signals of status. Clothing is the language that separates the mortal from the supernatural. In Hittite imagery, men and male gods usually wear short tunics that fall above the knee, often belted at the waist. Women and goddesses are most often shown in long garments, more enveloping and formal, emphasizing presence rather than movement. The clearest marker of godhood is the horned headdress. The more horns, the greater the rank of the deity. That single symbol can turn a figure from ordinary to cosmic authority. Some late kings even appear wearing horned crowns themselves, suggesting a political message of divine closeness and sacred legitimacy. More commonly, though, royal figures wear a simpler cap and long robes, presenting themselves as dignified participants in ritual rather than as gods in their own right. Scale can also speak. When a protector deity is carved larger than the king it embraces, the message is immediate. The ruler stands under divine shelter and guidance. And across many reliefs, both gods and humans share the same distinctive footwear, shoes with upward curving toes. It is a small detail, but it gives these scenes a consistent visual identity, as if the entire world of the image belongs to one recognizable culture. Jewellery appears on both mortal and divine bodies. Hoop earrings and other ornaments show up in reliefs again and again, even though actual finds are scarce. That may be because people carried valuables away in times of crisis, and because the richest royal burials are still missing from the archaeological record. Even so, a few small precious pendants survive and they are revealing. Tiny figures of a seated goddess holding a child or a warrior god with a raised weapon give us a glimpse of what larger sacred images might have looked like. Those miniature pieces point toward a major art form we largely lost, the cult statues of the gods. Inside temples, the most important deities were not just ideas, they were treated as present. Their images were built from wood and covered with metal, sometimes with inlaid details that made the figure shimmer in torchlight. The statue could be washed, dressed, fed, and carried in processions. Ritual was the mechanism that turned an object into a living focus of divine presence. The temple, then, was not simply a building dedicated to a god. It was the god's house, and the image inside was the doorway between human and divine. Hittite sacred images were not always human-shaped. A god might be represented as a bull or as a disc, or even as a weapon. One of the most dramatic examples is the sword-shaped deity carved with animal features, a divine blade that seems to pierce the boundary between the world above and the realm below. This is Hittite religion expressed through bold visual metaphor. The god is not carrying the object itself is the god. Animals, in fact, are everywhere in Hittite imagination. They help define the line between civilization and wilderness. Domestic animals appear as symbols of order and control, brought calmly toward ritual as if they understand their place in the human world. Wild creatures represent the unpredictable power beyond the walls. They are feared, admired, hunted, and turned into symbols. A fox can stand for treachery. A lion can stand for kingship. The animal world becomes a moral vocabulary. Some creatures are so central that they feel almost timeless. The deer, for example, runs through Anatolian iconography across centuries, appearing in early ritual objects long before the Hittite Empire and continuing through later sacred imagery. In Hittite art it can be prey, but it can also be divine. We often see a deity mounted on a stag, an image that turns the animal into a moving pedestal for supernatural authority. Stories and sayings built around such animals carry practical lessons. Respect the place that sustains you. Do not curse the shelter that feeds you. Remember that safety sometimes depends on knowing where you belong. Other animals define the gods themselves. War deities are often linked with lions. The storm deity is tied to bulls, either standing upon them or riding behind them in a chariot pulled by them. Mountains can even become living supports, carved as stooped divine beings beneath the weight of a god's vehicle. These are not naturalistic scenes. They are statements about cosmic order, gods above, the world beneath, and living forces holding everything in place. Festivals brought that cosmic order into public view. Ritual descriptions speak of precious metal animals carried in procession, not as mere decoration, but as walking symbols of the god's presence. A stag, a panther, a boar, a wolf, a lion, each one reflecting a divine connection. The parade becomes a moving map of the pantheon, and the community witnesses power made visible. For Hittite royalty, few creatures carried the prestige of the eagle. It was admired for speed, height, and that piercing vision that seems to read the world from the sky. In ritual thinking, the eagle was more than an animal. It could serve as a courier between human beings and the divine realm, a living bridge launched upward into the open air. Some ceremonies treated the eagle almost like a message written in feathers. A live bird might be passed above the king and queen while sacred words were spoken, then released so it could fly into the heights and carry the request for long life. In other rites, even a single wing could become a ritual tool, used to call the gods closer, as if movement and air were a language the divine could hear. This reverence for the eagle also shaped royal imagery. One of the most striking symbols is the double-headed bird of prey, two faces looking outward as if watching both horizons at once. We see it on small objects like seals and on monumental carvings, sometimes supporting deities in sacred scenes. It appears at gateways as well, where protective beasts and powerful symbols guarded the threshold between the city and the unknown. Long after the Hittite world collapsed, the double-headed eagle resurfaced in later empires as a sign of sovereignty, and it still appears in modern state emblems today, carrying that ancient message of authority and watchfulness. If the eagle represents the sky, Hittite sculptural cups represent the moment humans tried to share space with the gods. These vessels are among the most impressive Hittite artworks that survive. Metal drinking cups shaped like animals or sacred forms, crafted to be handled, raised, and used in ritual. Records show such vessels were made from precious materials, and some were even created from recycled treasure taken in war and reworked into new, Hittite-marked sacred objects. Different animals could be tied to different deities, so the shape of a cup was never just decoration, it was identity. Some of the finest examples take the form of a stag or a bull, The animal is not simply modelled, it is given muscle, tension and strength, as if the cup is an organism frozen in metal. Details like horns and eyes were treated with special care, sometimes fitted with inlays that would have made the creature appear more alive in shifting light. Around the body of a vessel, relief scenes sometimes unfold like a miniature ritual drama. A seated deity receiving offerings, attendants approaching with bread and drink, hunters giving thanks for success, sacred space marked by objects that signal the boundary between ordinary ground and holy ground. Other cups take even stranger forms. One famous example is shaped like a clenched fist. That choice matters because Hittite worship could focus on the power of specific divine body parts as symbols of will and action. The hand, in that logic, stands for the force that makes decisions real. Around the wrist of such a vessel, a ritual procession may be shown in relief. A ruler pouring an offering, attendants carrying food, musicians playing, and the divine figure standing at the centre of the scene. The cup becomes a portable ceremony, a sacred moment cast into silver. These ritual vessels did not appear out of nowhere. Earlier communities in Anatolia had long experimented with animal-shaped drinking vessels in clay, and many creatures were used: lions, bulls, birds, deer, boars, and more. Over time, the craft moved from terracotta into precious metal, and the function became more formal, more elite, and more tightly tied to temple life. Even when we do not know the precise excavation history of certain silver cups, the iconography points strongly toward religious use, libations, feasting, and the careful choreography of approaching the gods. Here we reach one of the most intriguing ideas in Hittite ritual practice: the concept that a ceremony could involve drinking in a way that created closeness with the divine. The simplest explanation is that the participants raised a cup in honour of a god. But some rituals suggest something more intimate: a shared drink, part given to the deity, part consumed by the human celebrants. In that model, drinking is not only submission, it is participation. A libation can express hierarchy, human below and God above. Sharing a drink suggests a different relationship, a bond reinforced by the act of consuming what has touched the sacred sphere. That is also why purity mattered so much. When an object is used to move between human hands and divine presence, it must be treated almost like a living thing. Ritual texts emphasize cleansing, washing in flowing water, then anointing with oil, as if the vessel needs the same care a person would need after purification. The cup is not just a tool, it is part of the ritual body of the ceremony. From here, the wider religious landscape comes into focus. The Hittites famously described their realm as a land overflowing with gods. This was not just poetic exaggeration, it reflected a real habit of absorption. When new regions came under Hittite control, local deities were not automatically erased. Often they were welcomed, installed, and honoured. Sometimes sacred images were brought back to the Hittite heartland and revered there, as if the gods themselves had been persuaded to remain under Hittite authority. Keeping a god close could mean keeping a territory secure, because a land without its divine protector was a land easier to hold. At times, similar deities were blended together, especially when they overlapped in role or symbolism. But very often, each local version remained distinct. Multiple storm gods could exist side by side without being forced into a single identity. After conquests in Syria, important foreign cults could be replicated in the Hittite capital, as if a powerful shrine had been transplanted and given a new home. All of this created the perfect environment for myth to travel, merge, and transform. Hittite religion preserved traces of older Anatolian traditions, while also absorbing powerful narratives from neighbouring cultures, especially those of the Hurrians. In these stories, we find dramatic cycles about divine succession, conflict, and the struggle for cosmic order. One major mythic pattern begins with a primordial ruler of heaven, then a younger god rises against him, and then another rises again, repeating the violence of overthrow. The lesson is stark. Even the heavens can be unstable, and divine power can be contested, seized, and remade. In the old stories carried through the Hittite world, power in the heavens never stays still for long. One god rises, another is pushed aside, and the struggle repeats like a storm season that keeps returning. In one famous cycle, the conflict is so violent and so strange that it turns the body itself into a battleground. A sky ruler is attacked and wounded in a way meant to end his line forever, yet the act creates the opposite result. The victor becomes pregnant with the next great storm god, as if the future forces its way into existence through the very violence meant to stop it. The storm god is born, grows strong, and challenges the older generation just as they once challenged their fathers. The defeated rival refuses to accept the new order. Instead, he searches for a way to strike back, not through open battle but through creation of a weapon. He seeks out the hardness of the earth itself, mates with stone, and from that unnatural union a giant is born, a towering enemy made to crush the storm god's rule. At first the stone giant seems unstoppable, and the storm god is pushed back. But the storm does not win alone. The wider circle of deities rallies, alliances form, and the giant is finally overcome. The message is clear. Even in myth, survival depends on coalition, and a single god's power is never truly isolated. These ancient plots echo far beyond Anatolia. When we compare them with later Greek traditions, familiar patterns appear. Generations of gods overthrowing one another, the storm god emerging as the final victor, and the body becoming a source of new divine life. The resemblance is not a perfect match, but the rhythm feels shared, as if stories travelled across seas and borders, reshaped by new tongues while keeping their bones. The same cross-regional feeling shows up in the Dragon Slayer tales. The storm god faces a serpent enemy and loses at first, stripped of vital parts and left weakened. Victory does not come from strength alone, but from strategy. In one version, the storm god uses marriage and family ties as a trap, recovering what was stolen through a clever request during a wedding exchange. In another version, the god set a feast that leaves the monster helpless, and only then can it be destroyed. The pattern is repeated in other Mediterranean myths too. The storm god humiliated, then restored, then triumphant. It is not just a fight against a monster. It is the world reasserting balance after a moment of chaos. Another branch of these traditions tells of a figure born between worlds, part mortal and part divine, who grows up mocked for lacking a father. When the truth of his origin is finally revealed, he turns ambitious and dangerous, trying to force the sky itself to obey. In one striking episode, he pulls the sun and moon down as if they were trophies. Yet even as they plead for mercy, the story hints at the cost of such violence. If the lights of the world are harmed, the ruler inherits darkness. Like many tales about reckless ascent, the rise is followed by a fall. The heavens cannot be seized without consequences. Beyond these battles, Hittite storytelling often returns to a different kind of crisis, the missing god. When a major deity vanishes, the world does not simply feel sad or uncertain. It breaks. Warmth fades, growth stops, homes become choked with stillness, and even animals refuse to reproduce. It is not just famine or winter, it is a cosmic malfunction. In this worldview, fertility, weather and order are not mechanical systems. They are living relationships, and when the divine presence withdraws, everything dries up with it. So the gods search, and rituals imitate that search. The goal is not only to find the missing deity, but to soothe them, to cool their anger, and to bring them back into place. When the return finally happens, the world begins again. Rain falls, fields recover, and the shift into spring becomes more than a season. It becomes proof that order can be rebuilt. Even darker forces may be dealt with the same way. Sickness, grief, violence, and fear are imagined as things that can be sealed away, locked into a container, and pushed down to the depths, removed from the surface where humans live. Some stories bring this divine authority down into ordinary life. A hunter becomes so obsessed with desire and comfort that he neglects his duties, and the gods respond by hiding the animals of the wild. He searches for months and finds nothing, starving in the mountains, haunted by warning dreams that point toward punishment. The lesson is sharp. Prosperity is not guaranteed, and the natural world is not ours to command. If the gods are ignored, even skill and effort can turn empty. Other tales are even stranger and more unsettling. A queen gives birth to an impossible number of sons, sets them adrift, and they are raised far away. Later she bears daughters and keeps them, and when the grown sons return, the gods cloud recognition so that family cannot see family. A marriage plan forms, and only one voice resists it, warning that something is deeply wrong. The ending is lost, but the tension remains. These myths often place taboo at the edge of the story, forcing the audience to feel the danger even without seeing the final act. Then we meet another theme that appears across many cultures: the childless couple. The gods notice their longing and intervene in bizarre ways. A child may appear through an unnatural birth, be rejected, then placed into the path of someone who desperately wants a family. The gift is real, but the humans who receive it may still behave selfishly, staging scenes to extract food and presents from their neighbours. Even divine generosity does not automatically create virtue. In another story, a wealthy man has everything except an heir, and that absence makes his wealth feel hollow. He goes to seek answers, and the solution is almost comically human. Learn what you are doing, go home, and live properly as a husband. The couple finally has children, but the story does not end with happiness. The sons grow into rivals, property becomes a battlefield, and the dispute is taken before divine judges. Right and wrong become more than names. They become forces arguing over inheritance, status, and justice, while the gods themselves struggle to settle what humans cannot. Copies of the Gilgamesh story were not only known in Mesopotamia. Pieces of that famous epic turned up in the Hittite capital as well, preserved on tablets in several languages used by the scribal world. Gilgamesh, remembered as the mighty ruler of ancient Uruk, is shown moving through a chain of adventures that feel larger than life. He travels to distant forests in search of prized timber, confronts dangerous beings, and even faces a heavenly bull sent to punish human pride. Yet for all his victories, the tale keeps returning to one central idea: strength cannot defeat time. The story ends with a desperate search for a way beyond death, and that search proves painfully limited. In the Hittite setting, these tablets seem to have served a practical purpose. They were often copied as training material, a way for scribes to master different written traditions and sharpen their skills. But the Hittite versions were not always simple copies. Some passages were reshaped to fit local religious instincts. Instead of presenting Gilgamesh as a hero born from unusual parents, one Hittite retelling describes him as a figure assembled by the gods themselves, given power and stature as if crafted for greatness. In that telling, the divine forces most emphasized are the ones that mattered most in Hittite belief: the powers of storm and sun. A few episodes in the Hittite tradition also feel uniquely coloured by local taste. In one scene, Gilgamesh meets a lunar figure on the open steppe after killing lions, and the encounter becomes a kind of sacred transaction, linking royal prowess with temple devotion. In another fragment, the hero faces the sea itself as if it were a living being with its own voice, and the exchange turns hostile. These moments give the impression that the Hittite scribal world was not only preserving a foreign masterpiece, but also bending it slightly toward themes that resonated at home. From here, the focus widens to the wider divine landscape of Hittite life. The Hittite religious world was not narrow or exclusive. It grew by addition. New gods could enter the system without pushing old ones out. Conquest, diplomacy, and neighbourly contact all brought deities across borders, and the safest policy was often to respect every power that might matter. In royal prayers, rulers sometimes listed long strings of divine names, almost as if they were building a net meant to catch any neglected god before that god could become angry. At the head of this vast divine crowd stood two great forces, storm and sun. Together they were treated as the ultimate owners of the land, the ones who kept fields alive and seasons turning. The storm brought the rain and the roar of power. The sun brought warmth, clarity, and growth. Between these two, life was possible. That is why the king and queen were more than political figures. They acted as the human face of divine order, and after death they could be honoured as sacred ancestors, still present within the life of the state. Around these chief powers gathered a wide range of specialised gods. Some were tied to birth and the home, some to the hunt and the wild spaces, some to craft work and the furnace fire of metalworking. The Hittite imagination treated the world as filled with active forces, not distant abstractions. Rivers, mountains, winds, and clouds could be called as witnesses to agreements. Even the household could be seen as populated by sacred presences, with key parts of a home treated as if they carried protective power. This was a way of making reality legible, naming the forces that shape life and giving them roles. Certain gods also rose higher for particular rulers, becoming personal protectors. In these relationships, the bond is not described as replacing other worship, but as adding intimacy. The protector guides, shields, and sometimes grants victory. Art and stories reinforce this pattern. The king is shown not as independent, but as someone upheld by a greater presence. Success in harvest and war signalled divine approval. Failure, on the other hand, could be read as punishment or withdrawal. When enemies captured sacred images or looted temples, it was not only theft. It was a public sign that a city's divine support had been shaken. This created a pressure that ran through royal life. Rulers were expected to answer for disaster. They spoke to the gods with emotion, fear, and exhaustion. In these prayers we hear a human voice behind the crown, a person trying to explain, to plead, to restore balance before the state breaks apart. There is also a harsher truth beneath the prayers. If people die in great numbers, the gods lose their offerings. The relationship is not only reverence, it is mutual dependence, a system that requires maintenance to keep both worlds functioning. Alongside worship and protection, Hittite religion also carried a clear sense of fate. Some divine figures were believed to measure the length of life and determine when it would end. Destiny could be imagined as something spun out like thread, or written down like an entry in a record. People could blame these forces for sudden loss, broken marriages, or a life cut short. Death itself had its own ruler, and the fear of punishment after death gave extra weight to oaths and treaties. It is not surprising that important agreements were sometimes placed under the care of underworld powers, as if breaking the words would invite the goddess to act. Rivers mattered deeply in this worldview. They were not only water, they were boundaries and passageways, places where purification could happen, and where contact with deeper forces felt possible. Rituals by a river could involve washing, offerings, and the use of clay taken from the riverbed. Clay could be shaped into small figures or symbolic objects and then destroyed, as if breaking the material could break a curse. There were also ceremonies that treated the riverbank as the place where humans were first formed, born from fertile mud under the authority of motherly powers. In that sense, the river became both a birthplace and a road leading away, tied to life and departure at once. For most ordinary people, the world after death was not pictured as a bright paradise. Many descriptions present it as a dim, harsh place where recognition fades and existence becomes thin and joyless. This darker tone feels close to Mesopotamian traditions, yet rulers were treated differently. The death of a king or queen could be spoken of as a transformation into a divine state. Because of that, royal funerals were long, complex and intensely symbolic, designed to carry the ruler safely across the boundary and to stabilize society after the loss. Over many days, rituals unfolded in stages: sacrifice, offerings, purification, feasting, burning, collecting remains, and creating a lasting image of the dead ruler's presence. Objects were broken or burned as if being transferred to another realm. Tools connected to farming, hunting, and production were symbolically sent along, suggesting a belief that the ruler's status continued, with an exclusive kind of afterlife equipped with the markers of civilization. The ceremonies also served a political purpose. A kingdom could not afford spiritual chaos. By finishing the mourning rites correctly, order could be restored, and the next ruler could take power without the shadow of imbalance hanging over the state. When we move from death to daily worship, the surviving ritual texts become our richest guide. There was no single rigid formula, but patterns repeat. Many rites aimed at health, protection, prosperity, and success. Some were state-level actions meant to secure the fertility of the land or the outcome of military plans. Others belonged to private life, focused on sickness, fear, and misfortune. Temples were central, yet many ceremonies happened outside in places thought to be close to the gods: hills, rocks, and dramatic formations in the landscape where divine presence felt near enough to touch. At the heart of many rituals stood sacrifice. Animals were carefully chosen, purified, and dedicated, then led in procession with music and chanting. The slaughter itself was ceremonial, and the food that followed was not only a meal, it was a message. A portion was placed before the god, marking the offering as received in the divine realm, while the remainder was shared among the human participants. This shared eating mattered. It expressed exchange and reciprocity. The idea that worship was a relationship that had to be fed and renewed. Offerings were not limited to meat. Liquids were poured out as gifts: wine, beer, honey, milk, oil. Blood could be collected and used in specific ways, especially in ceremonies connected to underworld powers. Food could even be scattered along a path to draw a god toward the ritual space, as if the deity could be invited like a guest. In some cases, offerings were fully burned, given entirely to flame, leaving nothing for human hands. Valuable objects could also be dedicated and stored, creating temple treasuries filled with wealth meant to remain untouched out of respect. Festivals were simply rituals multiplied, arranged across days and tied to the rhythm of the year. The turn of the month, marked by the new moon, could bring a major gathering with food distribution and communal participation. Many festivals followed the agricultural calendar, turning planting and harvest into sacred drama. Others could be triggered by sudden signs, like thunder heard at the palace, as if the gods themselves had announced that ceremony must begin now. These gatherings were expensive and demanding, but they created unity through shared meals, music, and performance, and they reinforced the belief that the world stays stable only when the gods are honoured on time. Hittite festivals were not quiet affairs. Music, movement, and public spectacle were built into the celebration. We hear again and again about dancing, singing, and long processions that carried offerings, people, and sacred objects from one place to another. The soundscape mattered. Harps and lyres carried melody, drums drove the rhythm, and flutes, horns, and cymbals cut through the crowd. These were not private prayers. They were events meant to be heard across streets and courtyards, a kind of stage communication between the human world and the divine. Sometimes the festivals included performance that looked like theatre. people dressed in animal skins and played roles that blurred the line between humans and wild forces. We see figures presented as lion men, leopard men, dog men, bear men, wolf men. In one event, a leopard man is driven out of the city and chased toward the mountains, as if the community is pushing danger and disorder back into the wilderness. In another scene, a female archer fires at a bear man, misses once, then strikes him the second time while shouting a sharp cry of triumph. The point was not realism, it was symbolism made physical, acted out in front of everyone. Within these celebrations, there were also characters whose job was to shock, amuse, and break the tension. Some temple personnel performed outrageous stunts, even humiliating ones, as part of festival routine. We hear of a performer bathing naked in beer, and in another account enduring a dangerous act involving hot coals. These moments were not random entertainment. They worked like a pressure valve, turning anxiety into laughter and reminding everyone that festivals could contain chaos in controlled form. Not every festival took place in the same city. Some were anchored in the capital, but others required royal travel, with the king moving through the realm to honour major gods in different locations. Certain rites could even include strange gestures toward the cult image of a deity, treating the statue as if it were a living presence that could be restrained, negotiated with, and persuaded. The message is clear. These rituals did not treat the divine as distant. They treated the gods as active beings whose favour could be gained through correct performance. Food, especially bread, ran through Hittite ritual life like a constant thread. Bread could be a gift laid before the gods, but it could also be used in symbolic actions that feel unfamiliar today. We find bread used to seal openings, to close off pits where offerings had been placed, almost like a sacred plug that marks a boundary. In another multi-day rite that appears to prepare a crown prince for future rule, food becomes a lesson. The prince is made to grind grain by hand as part of the ritual sequence, performing the basic labour that keeps an agrarian world alive. Then a nighttime scene follows, heavy with symbolism. The prince lies inside a sacred space. Loaves are set beside his head and his feet, and beer is poured in a ring around him. The text that describes this moment breaks off just as the tension peaks, but the direction of meaning is hard to miss. A future king is being reminded in ritual form that feeding people and maintaining order is not optional. It is the core responsibility of power. Festivals also included sport, especially in rural communities. Athletic contests appear as part of local celebration. Boxing, wrestling, throwing heavy stones, lifting weights. Alongside these familiar forms, we also encounter something distinctly Hittite. A competitive ritual game centered on cheese. It begins with careful preparation of the cheese, then a presentation before the gods, and only then its distribution to the people. After blessing comes contest. Young men engage in cheese fighting, which may have involved throwing, striking, or passing the cheese in a rough team struggle. The exact rules are unclear, but the logic is visible. A major product of the countryside becomes both an offering and a communal event. And at the end, the food is likely eaten, not wasted. So the ritual loops back into the needs of everyday life. Beyond music, performance, and sport, another powerful tool ran through Hittite religion: divination. Oracles were used to ask what the gods intended and why misfortune had struck. These were not vague spiritual consultations, they were structured investigations. Questions were asked in sequence, narrowing down the cause of a problem until a clear answer appeared. If the harvest failed, was it because of a broken promise? Was it because of bloodshed? Was a particular god offended? Divination could also be used to choose the right date for a festival, or to confirm when a new ruler should take the throne. Many techniques were used. People watched birds and other animals for signs. They studied patterns in nature that were believed to be planted there deliberately by the divine. They also practiced inspection of sacrificial remains, especially the liver, which was treated as a map that could carry messages. Clay models of livers were even made as guides. divided into sections to help an expert read the markings found in a real organ. Another method used oil poured onto water, interpreting the shapes and movements as an answer. This was cheaper and more accessible, and it may have been favoured by ordinary people who could not sacrifice multiple animals. Some Hittite divination seems uniquely systematised. Instead of reading nature alone, it involved sets of tokens that represented people and ideas, such as the king, an enemy, prosperity, guilt, or divine protection. The tokens were assigned roles and values, and the oracle's outcome depended on how they were arranged and counted. The precise mechanics remain uncertain, but the intent is clear: to turn anxiety into procedure, to transform fear into a test that delivers a decision. Dreams were also treated as serious channels of divine communication. A dream could arrive on its own, or it could be deliberately sought by sleeping in a sacred space. A troubling dream might then become the subject of further divination, with priests testing possible interpretations until one was confirmed. Dreams could warn against travel, recommend a marriage, or demand an offering. They could also become bargaining spaces. In some royal dreams, a ruler promises a gift to a god in exchange for protection, health, or victory. These visions were not only personal experiences, they could be used politically, presented as proof that a god endorsed a king's rule. Behind all of this lies a Hittite way of thinking about illness and disorder. Sickness was not treated as purely mechanical. Social conflict was not treated as only human. Suffering, whether in the body or in the community, was often understood as the sign of something out of place in the cosmos. A deity might be angered. A taboo might have been broken. Pollution could spread from one person to another, sometimes even across generations. This is why purification mattered so much. If impurity was the cause, then cleansing was the cure. Ritual specialists, often women, played a major role in these remedies. They worked through symbolic actions that acted like metaphors made real. Fire could burn away anger. A fertile animal could represent restored fertility. A river could carry away evil the way it carries away objects. Pain and impurity could be transferred into a figurine and then destroyed. Wax was especially powerful because it could be shaped into the form of a problem and then melted away, as if the affliction itself was dissolving. Water stood at the centre of this obsession with purity. Bathing was not only hygiene, it was protection. Water could be prepared and consecrated, sometimes left out under the night sky as part of ritual practice. Springs and sacred pools mattered because they were steady sources of cleansing, and also because water was believed to connect different layers of reality. Even animals considered unclean could be used as tools of purification, absorbing impurity so it could be removed and destroyed. The logic is uncomfortable in places, but it is consistent. The evil must be taken into something else, then cast out. Alongside ritual specialists, physicians also existed, treating wounds, impotence, eye problems, breathing and stomach illnesses with food, poultices, and drugs. Yet even here the boundary between medicine and ritual is thin. A healer might sing, play an instrument, or join ceremonies directed at a god. Treatment was practical and spiritual at the same time, because recovery ultimately depended on divine permission. This brings us to the strictest side of Hittite religious life, the demand for cleanliness around sacred service. Those who prepared food for the gods were expected to be groomed, washed and dressed in clean clothing. Workspaces had to be scrubbed. Certain animals were kept away from areas where sacred bread was handled. The rules were not mild, and the punishments could be brutal. The same logic extended to the king. Royal purity was treated as a matter of state security. Even a small contamination, like a hair found in drinking water, could trigger severe consequences. In this world, cleanliness was not a private preference. It was a shield against cosmic danger. In the Hittite world, the health of the kingdom was tied to the health of the king. A ruler was not just a political leader. He was the living anchor of order, and when that anchor seemed threatened, people acted fast. Divination could warn that danger was near, and when it did, the response might look extreme to us. Instead of waiting for fate to strike, they tried to trick it. One striking solution was to place a temporary stand-in on the throne. A prisoner could be dressed and treated as if he were the monarch, marked with the signs of kingship, and ritually named as king. The logic was simple and terrifying. If disaster was hunting the king, it should be redirected to someone else. The substitute became a magnet for bad omens, short years, and violent fate. Once the danger had been pulled away, the real king could return to safety. This idea did not begin in Anatolia, and elsewhere it could end in the death of the substitute. In the Hittite setting, the goal was often removal rather than execution, pushing misfortune outward, back toward the enemy's lands. The same principle appears again and again with scapegoats. Hittite rituals frequently used animals or small crafted figures to carry sickness, fear, or evil away from a person. Words spoken over the victim could move the affliction, and so could touch. Sometimes an animal was waved over a body like a living sponge, absorbing what could not be seen. In one case, people even spit into the mouth of a dark-coloured sheep before it was sacrificed, as if illness and misfortune were being physically loaded into the animal. Birds, donkeys, goats, oxen, sheep, dogs, pigs, and even tiny creatures could serve this role. A small mouse, for example, could be given a piece of metal and then sent away in ritual language, ordered to carry the evil into mountains, valleys, and distant roads. We even find a fish, used like a moving channel to the sea, slapped over a patient in the hope that the sickness would swim away into deep water. One royal case shows how seriously this was taken. A Hittite king suffered a sudden loss of speech after a terrifying experience in a thunderstorm. The event returned in dreams, and in one dream a god presses a hand over the king's mouth. Whether the cause was spiritual shock or physical injury, the response was ritual and practical at the same time. An ox was chosen and made into the king's substitute. The king touched it, transferring the burden, and the animal was sent to a major sanctuary connected to the storm god. Along with it went a wagon load of royal belongings, including objects associated with the day the affliction began. These items and the animal were meant to be destroyed as an offering, as if the sickness could be burned out of the king's life. A second ox was also sent, an insurance policy in case the first one failed on the journey. It is a stark reminder of how fragile kingship could feel, even at the top of a powerful empire. If we want to understand ordinary life in Hatti, the richest doorway is law. The Hittite legal tradition preserves small snapshots of daily reality, because it talks about what happens when things go wrong. Many clauses follow a simple structure. If a certain harm is done, a certain remedy follows. We see a strong preference for compensation. If someone injures another person badly enough to make him unable to work, the aggressor might be required to provide medical care, replace the victim's labour during recovery, and pay a fine and the doctor's fee. The aim is not dramatic revenge. It is repair, repayment, and restoring stability. This does not mean punishments were soft. Property protection mattered, and merchants were treated as vital. Their goods connected the kingdom to materials and luxuries that could not be produced everywhere, so theft from traders carried heavier consequences. Because the economy depended on farming, damaged crops and livestock drew special attention. Even so, the death penalty appears less often than we might expect, partly because manpower mattered and losing workers harmed the state. Exile could be a common alternative, while certain sexual crimes could be treated far more harshly. For some offences like breaking oaths or leading rebellion, blinding appears as a punishment, turning a dangerous figure into someone who could be controlled and forced into labour. Justice was handled locally, often at city gates, where people swore oaths and gave testimony. When a case could not be resolved, an ordeal might be used, including tests involving water or other dangerous challenges meant to reveal truth through survival. Yet above local judgment stood the king. One key idea was that anyone living inside the empire could appeal to the ruler against a regional decision. Law was not only a local matter, it was a vertical system with the monarch at the peak. Work in Hatti was usually inherited. Many people learned the trade of their father, and families could pay to place a son under a skilled craftsperson as an apprentice. Training had a cost, and mastery could demand even more, sometimes requiring a substantial payment that shows how valuable expertise was. Craftspeople might work independently, or they could be attached to temples and palaces where steady demand existed. Some positions were assigned through royal authority, but for most people, the centre of life was agriculture. Farming was not always one neat block of land. A household could hold or manage several small plots spread across different places. One plot might support the home and most animals, while another meadow elsewhere might be used for grazing oxen. A third place might hold a vineyard, and another an orchard. This scattered pattern was not chaos, it was strategy. By spreading land across locations, families could exploit different soils and climates, and protect themselves from local failure. The crop list shows a full practical diet. Different wheats and barley were staples. Vegetables like onions, garlic, leeks and greens appear alongside legumes such as lentils and chickpeas. Nuts and seeds show up as well, including sesame and flax, and herbs like cumin and coriander hint at kitchens that cared about flavour. Fruit was part of the landscape too. Apples, figs, pomegranates, pears, apricots. Grapes mattered not only as fresh food, but as raisins for travel and as the base of wine. Wine carried status, but it also carried ritual power. There were different kinds, described in ways that suggest taste, age, and quality mattered. Wine could be awarded as a prize in competition, yet much of its use seems tied to religious settings, where drink became part of communication with the gods. Olive oil belonged to both kitchen and temple. It flavoured bread, it anointed bodies and objects, and it served as an offering. In stories and ritual language, oil and wine can become symbols of what a land holds inside itself, and what a god might hold inside the heart toward the kingdom. Beekeeping contributed honey and wax, which mattered for sweetness, preservation, and ritual use. Sweet-baked foods appear in the record too, made from flour and honey combined with fat or oil, the kind of dish that still feels familiar in spirit. Livestock shaped daily survival, sheep and goats for milk and wool, cattle for labour and meat, horses and donkeys for transport, pigs and poultry for food. Eggs are strangely quiet in the surviving record, but birds are clearly present on the table. Much cooking seems to have relied on stews and soups, practical meals that stretch ingredients and feed many mouths. Meat could be expensive for the average household, so when it was abundant it could be dried to prevent spoilage and delay consumption. In the Hittite world, kingship was never only political, it was sacred work. The king stood at the crossroads between human society and the divine realm, acting as the leading ritual figure of the state. The land was understood to belong to the gods, and the king ruled it as a caretaker, not an owner. That belief shaped everything. When crops failed, when war turned badly, when sickness spread, the explanation did not stop at human mistakes. The kingdom's relationship with the gods was considered a living bond, and the king was the one expected to maintain it. This sacred duty did not cancel the other demands of power. The king had to conquer, defend borders, and prove his strength in war. He judged the highest legal cases and served as the final authority when disputes could not be settled locally. He spoke for the kingdom in diplomacy, sending letters, receiving envoys, and sealing agreements with foreign rulers. Yet for most people, the king was distant. Many citizens would only see him briefly during major festivals or public ceremonies. That distance meant the king depended heavily on a web of officials who carried royal authority into daily life. Inside the capital, security and administration were divided among specialized groups. Guards protected the king in public and on campaign, while elite security units watched over palace precincts. Civic management in the city was placed in the hands of a chief official who handled practical concerns that could make or break urban life, keeping streets safe, ensuring access to water, organizing sanitation, and preventing disaster. Few dangers were feared more than fire. In a city of timber and mud brick, a single neglected flame could erase months of labour and generations of building. The warnings were severe, demanding constant vigilance during temple events and strict responsibility for extinguishing fires at night. Negligence was treated as a threat to the whole community, not a private mistake, because one accident could spread into a catastrophe. City life also relied on order at the gates. Closing them properly each evening was not a symbolic act. It was a security measure, and seals could be used to reveal tampering the next morning. Beneath the top, civic officials, supervisors and watchmen helped control different districts, enforce rules, and maintain daily stability. Beyond the capital, the empire was held together through layers of delegated authority. Provincial governors acted as the king's stand-ins, enforcing royal commands, settling disputes, monitoring threats, supporting temples, and keeping production steady. Further out still were the vassal states, where local rulers kept their thrones only by swearing loyalty. These agreements demanded tribute, military support when called, and strict limits on independent foreign dealings. Loyalty was framed like a relationship of protection. The great king would defend the vassal, but only so long as the vassal did not turn his eyes elsewhere. Hittite power did not look the same in every region. Some territories were treated as partners under oath, while others were held more tightly. In key strategic zones, control could be maintained by installing royal family members as regional rulers, creating a second tier of government that answered directly to the central court. This was empire management by mixture, treaties in one place, direct rule in another, and constant communication to keep the system from slipping. When we look at everyday life, gender roles were clearly defined and often unequal, and the culture carried the harsh assumptions common to the ancient world. We can see it not only in stories, but in the symbols used to represent what society considered masculine and feminine. Weapons and hunting gear were treated as male markers. Tools of spinning and weaving were treated as female markers. These symbols appear in rituals and oaths in revealing ways. Disloyal soldiers could be threatened with humiliation through forced feminization, a punishment meant to strip them of honor by turning the social order upside down. Meanwhile, healing rituals could reverse the symbolism in the other direction, as if masculinity itself could be ritually restored to cure sexual weakness. The underlying message is blunt. In public ideology, female-coded objects were treated as inferior and male-coded objects as the ideal. Yet the story is not simply one of female exclusion. In religion, the female principle was deeply respected. The divine world contained powerful goddesses tied to fertility, birth, grain, and the survival of the household. That religious respect created real openings in human society. Women could hold authority, especially in royal life and ritual practice. Queenship was the most visible example. The queen was not merely a spouse. She acted as a leading ritual figure, managed temple assets, travelled to major cult centres, and participated directly in ceremonies across the empire. When kings were away campaigning, queens could become the practical centre of government in the capital, handling stability at home while the army moved abroad. After death, queens and kings alike could receive continued reverence in royal cult practice, showing that their status did not end at the grave. Marriage, however, was largely framed as property and alliance rather than romance. Bride payments and dowries structured the arrangement, and a woman's dowry could remain tied to her as personal wealth, even as the household was managed by her husband. Divorce was possible for both partners, and incest was forbidden, while adultery could lead to deadly punishment. Some legal logic shows an unsettling preoccupation with whether a woman could call for help, using location as a way to judge consent. It is a reminder that protection and control often came mixed together in ancient legal thinking. Widows could be supported through family-based arrangements designed to keep them inside a protective network, revealing a society that feared instability as much as it feared scandal. Childbearing was treated as an expected duty, especially in royal politics where heirs meant stability. Pregnancy and birth were surrounded by ritual boundaries. Purifications, offerings, and rules meant to prevent pollution from spreading. Birth itself was managed by specialists. Midwives prepared tools, spoke protective words, and guided the process, while priests could perform acts meant to hold back harmful forces. Afterward, naming rituals and reintegration ceremonies returned mother and child to the community. Even these intimate moments were treated as matters of cosmic balance, not only family life. Outside the palace, most women worked in domestic and agricultural roles, but that does not mean they were invisible. Women laboured in fields, prepared food, produced textiles, performed music and dance, and kept inns. Their labour became even more essential when men were away on repeated campaigns. A city could not keep functioning if half its workforce disappeared, so women's adaptability was not optional. It was structural. Perhaps the clearest sign of women's influence appears in ritual expertise. Many ritual texts and practices were associated with female specialists who performed healing, purification, and protective rites. Their work blended speech, symbolism, and action, treating words as tools with real force. They could be multilingual, using inherited knowledge drawn from different cultural traditions, and they trained successors across generations. In a world where the divine was believed to shape health, fortune, and politics, the people who knew how to speak to that divine realm held a form of power that went beyond rank and wealth. At the bottom of Hittite society were enslaved people, and slavery was treated as both a labour system and a market. Enslaved workers had a price that varied with their skills, and they could be bought or sold like other valuable assets. Many were foreigners taken in war and carried back as part of the spoils of conquest. But war was not the only path into bondage. Serious crimes could lead to enslavement, and in some cases a household might be forced to hand over a son to serve the victim's family. Debt could also trap a person, turning unpaid obligations into a loss of freedom. Yet the system was not only brute ownership. The legal picture suggests something more complex and, in a cold way, practical. Enslaved people could hold property and gather resources, sometimes enough to buy their own freedom. Many worked in agriculture, and some were given plots to cultivate for themselves alongside the work they owed their owners. This kind of arrangement was not kindness. It was a strategy for productivity. A worker who could gain something from effort was more likely to produce more, and the Hittites, like many ancient states, were constantly trying to squeeze stability from limited manpower. The laws also show that status shaped justice. Compensation payments were often lower when the guilty party was enslaved rather than free, and legal penalties were calibrated by class. At the same time, the same law collections describe harsher physical punishments directed at enslaved people. Mutilation, blinding, and other brutal measures meant to enforce obedience through fear. Even so, there was a tension built into the system. A master could damage a human body, but doing so also damaged an investment. Injuring a labourer reduced work capacity and lowered resale value. In that sense, cruelty had limits not because morality restrained it, but because economics did. One striking detail in the legal record is how social boundaries could be crossed in unexpected ways. Enslaved men could sometimes negotiate marriages with freeborn women by paying a bride price. In such unions, the woman's free status was protected and their children could be born free. That meant slavery could be a personal dead end without being a genetic one. A single generation could sometimes shift a family line out of bondage, not through revolution, but through money and legal recognition. When the Hittite Empire collapsed at the start of the 12th century before Christ, the culture did not vanish overnight. In Anatolia and northern Syria, a patchwork of smaller kingdoms continued many older traditions for centuries. These states did not share a single central authority, and rivalry between them could flare into fighting. Written administration changed, and old styles of writing fell out of use, but the visual language of power remained vivid. Rulers carved rock reliefs, built monumental gateways, and filled public spaces with imagery that echoed the great age of Hattusa. We can see continuity in the art. Lions still guarded entrances. Familiar divine figures appear standing on their sacred animals. Royal and hunting scenes remained popular, and certain details of dress endured as visual signatures of identity. At the same time, innovation crept in. Older motifs were reworked into new forms, and local creativity blended with inherited tradition. These artworks would later influence the great palace relief programs of the Assyrians, whose own records, though biased, became one of the main windows onto the region's political story, because Assyria eventually conquered these kingdoms. Among these later states, Carchemish stood out as the largest and most important. It had been a major centre even under the empire, and its early rulers claimed legitimacy through family connections that reached back into the Hittite royal line. Dynasties changed over time, but the city remained powerful, and it developed a strong association with a protective goddess, whose image appears in reliefs with distinctive symbols of authority and blessing. In the end, Assyrian conquest brought the typical imperial solution: deportation of elites, repopulation, and the slow erasure of local identity under a new administrative order. One of the most haunting discoveries from Carchemish is a group of tiny figures buried centuries after they were made. These miniature divine images were crafted in precious materials long before the burial itself, and yet they survived, passed from hand to hand, until someone finally placed them in a grave. They look like echoes of an older sacred world preserved through upheaval. We cannot fully trace their journey, but their survival tells us that memory can be carried not only in stories, but in objects cherished as relics of a vanished age. In the modern era, the Hittites gained a second afterlife of a different kind. They became symbols. Archaeology, museums, and national storytelling turned Bronze Age remains into material for identity. Ancient monuments could be presented as proof of deep roots, of ancestral greatness, of belonging. In Turkey, interest in the Hittites became tied to state-building narratives in the early 20th century, when leaders promoted excavation and public fascination with Anatolia's distant past. Institutions and companies adopted names and symbols inspired by Bronze Age imagery, including the famous sun discs that now feel instantly recognizable in modern design. This is where we see how easily the past can be reshaped. Ideas about language and origins were sometimes pushed far beyond evidence, and grand claims about ancestry were used to create unity and pride. Even today, visitors in tourist regions may hear charming stories attached to certain pottery forms, presented as ancient ritual tools with mystical meanings. Sometimes those stories are based on a real archaeological shape, but decorated with modern imagination and modern aesthetics. The result is a product that feels ancient, even when its most dramatic claims are contemporary folklore, and that may be the most fitting final note. The Hittites themselves were masters of adoption and adaptation, absorbing deities, customs, and ideas across borders, then reshaping them into something distinct. Their legacy continued after their empire ended, not as a single straight line, but as a series of revivals, reinventions, and remembered fragments. Today, they remain less famous than many of their great contemporaries, yet their world was anything but dull. A society with unusual rituals, a legal culture focused on compensation, striking art objects from seals to animal-shaped vessels, and stories that still echo across later traditions. The gaps in the evidence do not weaken the fascination. They invite it, leaving room for discovery and for the imagination to keep walking forward.